Okay, and for those of you who just stepped in, the slide deck is at that URL if you want to download them. So, first of all, thanks for coming up. Coming after what must have been a very interesting lunch to take your post-prandial snooze in our presence. So we are going to be doing this tutorial on synthesizing explainable and deceptive behavior for human-AI interaction. It sort of is probably strange to talk about human-AI interaction and in the very second breath say deception. Why would you want to understand how to deceive? Why would you want to understand why AI systems should deceive humans? But as we'll find out in a minute, in general, it's basically the two sides of the same coin. The cooperation and the adversarial behavior are just two sides of the same coin. And so, in fact, it's worth understanding, how that happens too. So the way the structure of the tutorial essentially is the four of us are going to be doing this. We are mostly going to be tag teaming one after other. I'll show you in a bit the actual pieces where the handover occurs. So that's myself, Tadhagata, who's done quite a bit of work in this area. He's at IBM right now. And Sharat Sridharan, who's done also a whole bunch of work in this area. And Anagha, who is not only has done a lot of work in this area, but she's also very much into deception. So she will actually talk a lot about that aspect too. While a bunch of this is based on work that we have been doing in the lab, it's also, the tutorial itself actually covers lots of related work. So we go out of our way to make connections to a variety of concepts related to human-AI interaction. So that's something that it actually is meant to be a tutorial, not just a talk about our work. Like I said, that's where the slides are. And so this is the sort of the approximate syllabus, which may not make too much sense right now, but I'll come back to it in a minute. But this is a slide that you keep seeing all through the tutorial to see where you are, essentially. So my bit is to actually kind of introduce the area and sort of get you to understand the scope of the tutorial and which pieces will actually get done. And then Anagha and Tadhagata and Sharat will do various pieces. Then I'll come back and we can have more question and answer session. In general, since this is, we actually do have probably more than enough time. So if you have questions at any point of time, please feel free to stop us. Especially this is afternoon session, and I really do not want us all to fall asleep. I have a much nicer room to sleep, in fact, if I want to sleep, so I would rather not sleep here. So anyway, so that's the thing. So whenever you have any questions, please raise your hand, and it's a small enough room, we should be able to have a conversation. Okay, so so let me try to give you some introduction about what the lay of the land is for this tutorial. So in case, obviously, all of us are aware of the fact, unless you just crawled out of under the rock. Recently, AI is sort of bigger than you suppose. It's sort of bigger than you can suppose. It's been overhyped in both positive ways and in negative ways. It's either going to solve all the world's problems or it's going to kill us all. One of those two is likely to happen apparently. So while this is going on, the kind of thing that I really wish I had more of a hype about is AI systems actually working with humans in the loop and basically trying to help them as needed. So I would like to see at some point of time a CNN breaking news like this saying AI helps an old lady cross the street, it plays with kids, cooks food, and hangs around sans drama. No drama, just like boring life between us and our AI systems. This hasn't really been happening, unfortunately, because I just made this up. This is currently fake news. You don't ever really see this kind of a stuff in the news cycle. I mean, you really want to get news people to take attention to what you're doing, you should say we are about to end the civilization. That typically gets a lot more attention. saying that AI systems are working with humans obviously doesn't seem to. But in addition to just the outside world, it's interesting that AI as a discipline had a curious ambivalence to humans. I mean, as you know, we've been going around doing this discipline called AI since 1956 at least. But for the much of our existence in research, our systems seem happiest either far away from humans. Mars seems to be a good place, no people around, you can have lots of fun, or screaming the heck out of humans. You basically have systems trying to defeat humans in some game or other, so mostly adversarial aspects. John Lennon once said that you want to help humanity, it's the people that you just can't stand. And I sort of feel as if AI systems have this problem too, AI researchers have this problem too. We want to help people, humanity, but really working with people seems very boring. So to some extent, there's not been that much work. In fact, if you take an intro to AI course, you would not talk about AI-human interaction. Why not? Partly that's something that I'm going to address here. So of all the intelligences, the different kinds of intelligences humans have that AI systems try to replicate, this emotional and social and communicating intelligence, which really is very important for us to get along. For those of you who are old enough, you might know this comic called Rodney Dangerfield, who would say, I don't get no respect. They never got any respect. If you were working on social intelligence, for AI systems, that would not have been something that was very hard for quite a long time. Obviously, things have changed now, and at least in the beginning, part of the reason for this reluctance to some extent, and it's worthwhile understanding this, is there was this worry that if AI systems were to work with humans, if there's human in the loop, that would be the way AI systems will be cheating. And this is not an unwarranted worry. In fact, as you know, from the very beginning of mechanical Turk, the original mechanical Turk was not something that Jeff Bezos did. It was basically this contraption that would go from one European kingdom to another European kingdom trying to play chess. This is a robot that will play chess, except there is actually a human really, really deep inside the loop who was doing the actual chess, okay? This is the original human in the loop, and of course we still have the current version of this mechanical Turk. Those of you who might have heard of Sophia, which is basically, to me, I think of this as, that's a mechanical Turk, this is a mechanical Saud. She is the citizen of Saudi Arabia, apparently. And it's obviously this stuff too, for those of you are aware of what's going on with Sophia. There's a lot of subterfuge and there's a lot of prestidigitation involved. So this becomes humans in the loop always meant something bad, slightly bad. Okay. So I was worried about this, and so 2 years back when I got a chance to talk to AAAI, I had a talk on challenges of human-aware AI systems, and we talked about specifically why is it this, why don't we have human-aware AI systems interacting with humans. The research topics on that, why isn't it a lot more popular than they were at the currently are, and why we should pursue it, and some of the research challenges and long-term issues. I looked at that at that time, and in fact, one of the points that I tried to make, and it's come out today too, to some extent, is really we have the brains we have. I mean, it's been said that most of us are always depressed about our brains, but we have the brains we have not because we need to run away from the tigers or lions, but we have to always deal with each other. We are continually mental modeling each other's mental states and trying to use that to decide how to behave in such a way to either cooperate or deceive, etc. So social intelligence is very much a bigger part of our intelligence, and so essentially AI systems having social intelligence is really opens the goal. I mean, that it becomes a much bigger, broader aim for AI systems. I don't know how many of you already are aware of it. This is a little test called Sally Ann test, and it's a nice quiz to take right now. So this is Sally in a red shirt, and this is Ann in blue. Sally comes into the room, she puts her ball in the yellow box, and Sally goes away. Okay, Then after Sally goes away, Anne takes the ball from the yellow box, puts it in the gray box. Okay? Now you're seeing all this. You're seeing this whole fun, right? At this point, Sally came into the room. My question to you, since you're still alive and awake, where do you think Sally will look for her ball? Okay? Any of your thinking, what should be done, you clearly have difficulty in doing mental modeling. Okay? So it's well known that little kids have trouble realizing that what they believe in might be different from what other people believe in. And up until you realize that your model of the world might be different from somebody else's model of the world, in fact, there is no question of mental modeling. And once you do realize that, all sorts of interesting things happen. For example, you realize that to cooperate, you need to work hard at it, because just because you know something doesn't mean people working with you know the exact same thing. And also you can use it for basically deception. So I keep saying this when I give these kind of talks, that when my son told his first lie so many years back, I was really happy, because I knew he had a working brain. And to some extent, you only mostly been told not to lie, it's a bad thing. Not to lie is being able to realize that you know how to lie, but decide not to lie. That's what people are talking about. If you have a damaged brain, you don't even understand how to lie, because you don't realize that what you believe in may be different from what other people believe in. And lying actually comes very much as part of this mental modeling, as something that we will talk about in this tutorial. Okay. This is old stuff, but I think I think that's Chinese translation of what Phoebe and Rachel are saying, that in the old Friends, there's a beautiful Friends episode that you can watch tonight, where they are actually doing this almost K-level mental modeling, with Phoebe saying, they don't know that we know, that they know that we know. This is the level of games we can play with each other. We don't really want AI systems to play that level of games, but they should at least understand the first level of it for them to be able to cooperate with us. That's the point I'm trying to make. So you have an architecture of an intelligent agent. This is the kind of thing that we look at in the Intro to AI class. And the question, of course, is if I then, this agent essentially is interacting with the world, and we basically assume this world contains tables, chairs, water, and also people. And we didn't particularly care to differentiate between people versus other random inanimate stuff. But if you actually realize that the AI system realizes that there are people there, and in particular there is this one single, a couple of people whom you are trying to cooperate with or to do adversarial behavior with, it becomes important to be able to not only keep track of what your actions do to the world, but what your actions do to the other person's beliefs about you, the human in the loop's beliefs about you. Okay, so in particular, this is a busy slide. We will come back to this, and some of this notation becomes clearer as we go on through the tutorial. But I just want you to realize that pretty much everything about what an intelligent agent does will be affected when it takes into account the possibility there is somebody else in the loop who is continually modeling its behavior. Now, you might say, why can't we get humans who don't model other things? We don't have such humans. Humans always are anthropomorphizing whatever and whoever they're dealing with. Okay? So they are going to anthropomorphize AI systems. They're going to actually attribute beliefs to them. They're going to attribute goals to them. And they would basically behave with them to the extent they get along with the AI agents. It would be because they're able to do that. And so the only way AI systems can work with them is by themselves. They themselves have to model the mental states of the humans. So we've been pushing this. Actually, this stuff is now what Leech Guide 2016. We had a special theme on human over AI. There's a whole bunch of interest in human AI collaboration now. Of course, this is a partnership for AI. One of its thematic pillars is collaboration between people and AI systems. This has become very popular now. Lots of, at least in the US, lots of national research initiatives are very much interested in human AI collaboration, including the current administration actually has a pretty strong Office of Science and Technology Policy, They came out with these strategies for doing AI research right now, and number two is develop effective methods for human AI collaboration. So again, things have become a lot more interesting on this front for a while. So as far as this tutorial is concerned, the real question we're trying to ask to some extent is, what does it take for an AI agent to show either explainable or deceptive behavior in the presence of human agents? Between explainable and deceptive is completely nonsensical behavior, where you are just doing whatever you're doing and the people can't make sense of it. That is non-deliberate. So if you just randomly don't model people in the loop, your behavior is likely to be nonsensical. Either you want to cooperate or to deliberately deceive, you actually have to model it. So the simple answer to this, actually, in this tutorial is that to synthesize explainable behavior, it should not be surprising to you by this time, that AI agents need to go beyond just sort of deciding what behavior they are producing to reach their own goals, but also take into account the mental model of the humans in the loop. For the mental models, what are their beliefs, what are their goals, what are their actions, what are their capabilities. And when you have that, that's the first level. Furthermore, you also should want to actually take into account humans' own model of the AI agents' capabilities. So the idea is, when I'm talking to you, I know that you're already modeled. You have some model of what it is that I'm trying to do. And I have to take that into consideration in deciding whether or not my next action is likely to be comprehensible to you or not. So if I feel like dancing right now, I might suppress that urge because I have this sense that you didn't come to see me dance. Okay, so unless I just want you to wake you up or something, which I might do, if you keep on falling asleep, then I will dance and you'll wake up and you'll then will again go back to boring stuff. Okay, so the idea being that you want to keep this at least second level. Of course, in the friends example, we are doing 4 levels, and there are epistemologists, epistemic logic people say it can be infinite regress. What we're going to try and tell you is at least 2 levels will give us very interesting sets of capabilities. So that sort of leads us to this tutorial syllabus. I'm still in the middle of this introduction. We will then talk about how to provide behavior that makes sense to the human in the loop, and if it doesn't make sense to the human in the loop, provide an explanation which involves you deliberately asking them to change their model of the AI system's capabilities so that what the system is doing would become interpretable. And then, of course, we'll talk about how you could also use this to manipulate people's mental models to actually tell white lies if you want to. To some extent, cooperation sometimes, as the cooperation involves, actually telling them how to change their model of your behavior and your capabilities. But you could push them into believing things that are not true. You, the AI agent, which would be actually lying. And then we'll talk also about some application scenarios, and I'll show you some examples of right now, but we'll talk more about it at the And that's basically one level direction where this drill is going to go. Now, since I kept talking about models, let me show these 3 slides. That if you have a robot and you don't care, you're on Mars, you don't care about anything else, just you want to work with your own goals and so on. So you have a model of your own model of the world, the robot's model of the world, which it then uses to basically reach its goals. So again, much of this tutorial is sort of agnostic to whether the specific kind of decision model you use. You could use deterministic planning, you can use Markov decision processes if you are interested in stochastic dynamics and so on. We will give specific examples with specific models just so that it will be concrete, but most of the top level ideas are essentially are not dependent on it being a very specific kind of model. So if you have MR, then basically the robot can use that to sort of come up with a behavior that will reach its goals. If you are into reward metrics, then it will be optimizing the cumulative reward. Now, if there's a human in the loop, at the minimum, the human has their own model. Yes? Right.
So, I don't need interrupt for when you take questions.
As I said, you can stop me like just now. So I prefer that if people have questions, and I at least know how to handle questions. My students, but some of the other speakers may or may not. But so please ask me.
Thank you. I just want to clarify. Did I understand you saying that the way humans think is by models? So the only way the AI system can work is on their own? I saw a discrepancy.
No, all I'm saying is that when there are humans in the loop, they will go ahead and attribute a model to the robot. You know, I mean, there are these psychological, studies. In fact, there's this beautiful, very old psychological studies of sticks going around on a video screen, and then kids will start basically thinking of them as the sticks actually have goals and beliefs and so on. That's how the whole entire animation industry works. We don't really need, we anthropomorphize everything. And so humans do that, and so to work with humans, AI systems have to play that game. It's the same question about emotions, by the way. I still don't know whether AI systems need emotions to somehow do better performance-wise, okay? It's not, the jury is completely out on why we have emotions. But we do. There's no way we can shut them off, right? And so if a system has to work with us, it better at least understand and fake its own emotions. It's been told that those of you who might remember the Clippy the paperclip from the Microsoft, Rosalind Picard once pointed out that one of the many reasons why there was a spontaneous applause when Clippy the paperclip, which was supposedly trying to help people who are sad enough to use Microsoft products, the reason it basically, there was a huge spontaneous applause when it was retired is because essentially, as she said, when Clippy comes, it always had a smug look on its face. And the Clippy would come when you are in trouble because you got stuck somewhere. And so you don't want, if you're stuck somewhere, somebody comes with a smug look on their face, you feel like punching them, not taking their help. Again, this sort of syntax matters because it's not so much that the robots need the emotions, it is that we have emotions and we are going to expect emotions. It's the same thing for the modeling. It's we will model the robot's capability so the robot better take that into consideration. That's my point. Okay. So the human, when there's a human in the loop, human themselves might have their own model of the way the world is working. Now, if you are aware of this, at this point, it's just this is human's model, and if the robot then has like a approximation of that, MHR is the robot's approximation of the human. I'll say robot, but basically any AI system, that it can use that to assist, to avoid getting into the way, to sort of do some minimum teaming activities and so on. So that's like the first level. The second level is that, as I said, the moment there's a human in the loop, not only will they have their own model of the world, but they will make a model of the robot's capabilities. You're not going to be able to stop them. That's what they're going to do. And so then the robot has to take a version of, an approximation of that in deciding its behavior. So that winds up being this M hat or H, which is robot's approximation of what the human thinks robot's capabilities are. I tell you that that's the most important thing. In fact, your approximation of what you think my goals, my capabilities are, is what is stopping me from breaking into a song and dance sequence right now. Because you don't expect me to do that, so I'm not going to do it. Okay? So that once you have that MRH, that will be allowing us to do interpretable behavior. The behavior can essentially sort of conform to what people are expecting. In fact, if you behave the way people are expecting, you don't have to ever open your mouth because you're doing exactly what was expected of you. If on the other hand, it's not the case that if the expectations are kind of violated, then you want to provide an explanation as to how the model that the human has of your capabilities, the AI system's capabilities, is actually different from what the reality is. And that involves changing the model. So basically conveying some model differences to the human in the loop. And that would be explanatory dialogue. So that's where all this stuff about how, in every piece of this intelligent agent interaction, it needs to take into account how its actions are affecting these models. That's what we will be looking at. Now, what causes differences in mental models? Basically, the humans might have different expectations on the capabilities of the AI system. They might have different expectations on the state of the world than the robot thinks is the current state of the world. The goals may be different. Sensor models might be different. What the human sees might be different from what the robot sees, and so they wind up not, being on the same page. And they might, of course, also be using different representations. That means they don't even have a common vocabulary, in which case explanations become a lot more difficult. Okay. Now, where do these kind of models come from? In some cases, basically you start with the same model of the environment as some of the examples I tell you. For example, in search and rescue kind of scenarios, the human and the AI system might start with the same floor map of the environment. But then the robot winds up knowing more things have changed because it's actually in the disaster scenario, and it sees that more corridors are closed and there's more debris in some places. New things may have opened up because things have, like, where they used to be a door, the door collapsed, and so you in fact walk through, etc. So those sort of things can happen. Sometimes you can learn these in over longitudinal interactions with humans in the loop, and both of those are things that we will discuss, in the different parts of this work. In terms of applications that we will look at, I want to show you a few slides on that just to get a sense of what kind of applications will be discussed here. First of all, by the way, these are all the conferences where work that we're being discussed has been published by various people. So there's a variety of AI conferences as well as human-computer interaction conferences that are interested in these research issues. And so, of course, some obvious things always existed. For example, intelligent tutoring systems. From the day one, it was clear that an AI system trying to tutor a human being better have a model of the human being. There is like no other way. It's not like intelligent tutoring systems are there on Mars. Who are the teachers? Right? Similarly, social robotics. There's been a lot of pioneering work by people like Brazil and Brands, Castellati and Benz, also Brazil, who basically talked about having these little robots that play with kids, and they need to have some minimal abilities to do modeling of the humans in the loop. But those are not the only things. In fact, part of the examples that I'll show you are much more quotidian and much less of just the playing with the kids kind of variety. My point is that, in fact, AI systems, in pretty much any scenario, if there's a human in the loop, they need to model the human's mental state. Otherwise, the effectiveness would be completely, compromised. Okay? So that's basically, so we may need modeling in the case of assistants, human-aware digital personal assistants, office and hospital assistants, and also you can be using this in the teaming scenarios where you essentially half the problem is solved by the human, half the problem is solved by the AI system, for example, in collaboration. So to give examples, this actually, Tathagata will talk more about this later. But here is a scenario which sort of tells you there's a human as a commander's role, and then the robot is in the disaster zone. And so they will wind up having, beginning models they may have shared, and then they start slowly diverging because things are happening on the ground that the robot happens to know. And of course, the goals may have changed from the point of view of the commander. And so this involves essentially, some of these issues about how does the robot show interpretable behavior? How does it know what to tell the humans if it cannot show interpretable behavior? That's the explanation part. This one essentially is saying, sometimes you have an assistant which is mostly playing a reactive role, but then suddenly it starts providing proactive assistance. If you're giving assistance to people and if you have no sense of their mental model currently, then your assistance is likely to be nonsensical and people are likely to shut you off. Okay. So that's another example. This one essentially is, of course, the intelligent tutoring systems. In the case of tutoring systems, you clearly need to have a sense of this modeling of the human's mental state in the loop. And then any kind of decision support systems. In our own group, we have worked with NASA mission planning, or kind of scenarios where the humans still do the planning, but a background system, an AI system, tries to help them come up with better plans. Okay. Now, how do you do this without removing the control away from the humans? Where basically you could just say, stop, you're going crazy. I'll just make the plan and just take this plan now. That doesn't work most of the time because there are many more constraints that the AI system is not aware of. And so what it comes up with as a solution may not be a good solution from the human's perspective. And so it needs to sort of have a dialogue, and you need to provide suggestions that make sense based on their current mental state. And that winds up being very useful. There is one other more recent one. Actually, I believe there is like a demo at AAAI that IBM folks are doing with which essentially is a scenario where, in fact, some human is providing like a dialogue model to sort of an AI system, like in this particular AI planning system, which can then come up with a dialogue management routine. Except the humans might not have specified the model correctly, and so this, the interaction is a way for the humans to figure out what went wrong, so that they will, correct the model. Okay. So again, debugging becomes easier if your AI system will help you, essentially. So those are some of the explanations. One other thing that I want to say, two more things before we kind of end this part of a tutorial. I kept talking about humans, and anything we do, we are humans, so we know what we want. But that's an oxymoron. I kind of tend to say that engineers thinking they know what humans want is a bit of an oxymoron to begin with, because maybe we don't completely understand what humans want, and there really are systematic ways in which you can actually figure out the ideas that you have help or hurt a cooperative scenario, which is basically controlled experiments with humans in the loop. And so anybody working in this area who don't know what IRB is, in US IRB is Institutional Review Board, which basically you have to go through if you want to do any experiments on humans. You're not giving them injections, but you are playing with their minds. So you need to get that. If you don't know what IRB is, you're kidding yourself in saying I'm into human aware or human AI interaction, because it basically has to be done that way. And so we will talk about some of the ways, the evaluation of these kinds of techniques. It's pretty hard, but we can't just assume that I know that's what humans like, so we'll just do it. So evaluation is a very important thing. So in our case, for example, again, so I want to give you an example of the Tesla autopilot, which itself is a stupid name for an assistant. How do you call an assistant an autopilot and assume that people don't get don't misunderstand that? And second idea is Tesla autopilot's model of humans is you can completely ignore the road until when there's a problem, in which case you just come back into full-on attention in under 3 microseconds. Tell that to that poor guy who went under that truck. Okay, basically that sort of tells you that there are ideas that may not just make sense at all, given the human limitations, and an idea that looks good on paper basically may not work, and you want to be able to do careful evaluation. So in our case, for example, we work with people in human factors, but in general, I think human-computer interaction is a big thing. And if all computers are really doing AI, then human-AI interaction is going to be the big thing, essentially. And that's going to be an important thing. One other thing that I wanted to say here is explanation is like all the rage. People are talking about explainable AI all over the place. And I want to get you a sense of how what we are discussing here connects to what you might have heard of in explainable machine learning, for example. Okay? So the kind of explainable machine learning mostly it focuses on pointing explanations. So for example, you see this picture and your system says, this is a dog playing a guitar, and apparently you ask your system, explain yourself, why do you think this is a dog playing guitar? First of all, raise your hands. How many times have you asked your friends, why do you think this is a dog? Or why do you think this is a guitar? You need better friends, okay, if you have to ask those kinds of questions. And secondly, in this particular case, this is really debugging. You're not working with the AI system, you're debugging the NAM system. Okay, you're asking this question because it's completely messed up. So in particular, it eventually might just say, well, in this particular case, oh, I call this a Alaskan Husky. Why do you call this an Alaskan Husky? Well, there is some snow there. And then you say, okay, that's not a particularly good explanation. But that's not an interactive explanation. It's just a question of something that you're using to debug the machine learning system. And I want you to understand that pointing explanations are the most primitive of the explanations. We don't just point to things. So for example, get this one. So this is a school bus, and many of you probably know of these kinds of examples. And so I add some adversarial noise, I get this. How many of you realize what this other one is? We all know that it's an ostrich, right? Tell me, point which part of this makes this an ostrich? that sort of tells you the level of poverty of pointing-based explanations. What we ask each other typically for explanations are explanations about our decisions. Why did you come yesterday evening as against day before yesterday evening when AAAI started yesterday already? That's a question you might ask. Okay? Then if I need to point to you the reason, I need to show you a space-time tube of my life. That way we'll never have gotten anywhere. Okay? So in addition, basically what I'm saying is much of what we are looking at here is explanations in the context of behavior, which is a sequential decisions. Okay? A sequence of decisions. And you're asking why did you make a certain decision, and those typically won't work well for pointing explanations, because that's a very primitive way of doing things. Okay? So explanations, of course, are critical for collaboration, and also they're not just a soliloquy by the agent. You do have to provide explanation that is customized to the other person's model of the task. Okay? And so this is something else that I wanted to mention to you. So as I said, please point. If you ever wonder what's the difference between an explanation and a pointing explanation, ask yourself which part of this bus makes it an ostrich. And if you figure this out, you have a paper coming in like ICML, right? Because there's nothing in that we can make sense of that will actually make that an ostrich. Okay, the last thing I want to say is, of course, as I mentioned, once you start modeling the mental state of the humans in the loop, you can use that both to cooperate, which is to provide explicable behavior, provide explanations, and deceive. The explanation can essentially lead them to believe things about your capabilities that are not actually true. And it's just very simple for the system to do it. Either which way it can wind up doing, either cooperating or competing. And so in fact, we will look at some of the ideas of how deceptions can be generated. In some cases that might be a useful thing. If you want your AI systems to deceive your enemies in the loop, then you might want that. Okay, so that we'll talk about that too. But in general, it also opens up this question of do you want your Alexa to tell you a couple of white lies just to get you to do good things during your life? And this is an interesting question. So Tathagata will come back at some point in time and talk about the fact that this kind of lying essentially is very much feasible. And we actually did some interesting studies with talkers as to humans realize that their loved ones tell them lies all the time. Like, if anytime anybody asks you, do I look good? Here's an answer, yes. Never the no, okay, unless you want to break their friendship. Right? So, but the point is we do this all the time, but do we want Alexa to do that? Do we want Google now to do that? And how much are people willing to be told white lies? That's an interesting question. You can just say, why should we be doing this? Well, of course, it's possible. Once you do mental modeling, you open the door for both cooperation and deception. Those are things that we'll be discussing. So that sort of tells you where the tutorial syllabus is going. Anaga will now take over and talk about interpretable behavior, how to generate explicable behavior. And she will, by the way, not only talk about explicable, but a bunch of different definitions. So things you get into more details now. That bunch of different definitions in interpretable behavior, such as explicability, legibility, predictability, that have been used in the literature by various people, and she'll try to make sense of them in a unified way. Then Tathagata will come, and then also Sharat, in terms of explanations when the models are different versus explanations for debugging, where you assume the same model is held by both the human and the AI system. And one of the other interesting questions in terms of explanations is, sometimes explanations are needed because the models are different. The other times explanations are needed because the human did not have the capability to do the inference on the model that they already have. Okay, and so inferential explanations also wind up being important, and we'll talk about that too. And then Anaga, and then a whole bunch of extensions there will be brought in. And then Anaga and Tathagata will talk about manipulation of mental models and also applications. And then you'll ask questions whenever you have. There's one I'm going to take right now. And then, depending on how things go, we will have more discussion. Yes?
Yeah, I'm just curious about how you position human aware versus human centered.
Okay, so there's a joke about that. I mean, basically humans are all in the news right now for whatever reason AI discovered humans, just as after ignoring it. I don't actually understand. I know what this one is human AI interaction. So in fact, I'm not even necessarily saying human aware. I think it's okay. Humans have to interact with AI systems. So that's like less sexy. It's not a name I made up. People can understand. The question of, to be honest, I think there are other human compatible by Russell, which is please don't kill us. That's it. Okay, Russell just doesn't want AI systems to kill him. I don't know why, but that's what he wants. And so he's not interested in AI systems necessarily cooperating, etc. He just doesn't want them to kill us. Okay, so that becomes a human compatible. Human centered, I really don't know. I mean, honestly, because I think everything, if the humans are writing papers, then it's human-centered AI to some extent almost. Okay, so I don't necessarily know that any of them in the human-centered umbrella. It's big enough that it might very well cover everything I'm saying, but it also might mean that they don't particularly care about mental model. This is a lot more a special case, and my point is that if you want to interact with systems in an effective way, you have to understand that humans will be modeling the system's capabilities, and the system has to take that into consideration. Are there other questions? Yes, please.
So I understand that you're talking not just about making sure that the goal that the agent understands and the human is asking the agent to do should be same, but we are also talking about modeling, the mental model of humans should be same as what the
So the thing is, so here is a very interesting thing. The important thing is to understand that the mental models can be different. That when the models are different, who is right depends on the application. Okay, in a tutoring scenario, if the models are different and the human's model is different from the AI system's model, then AI system sort of trumps because it's a tutoring system. It knows what it's trying to teach. The probably student did not understand some concept. Whereas if you are in a commander robot scenario, like the USAR scenario, then if the robot doesn't understand, if the robot's model differs from the human's model, then it's actually the human who might trump, because they might know what goals that they really wanted to do. The point, of course, is taking this model difference into account allows for a dialogue to start, which can then make either the humans change their model about the robot, or they can come back and tell the robot or the AI system, no, actually you should change this part, which is exactly what happens in the dialogue management system where the human tried to give one model, but then they wrote it wrong. And so by this interaction, they were able to actually debug to some extent. But it's a much higher level debugging. The kind of thing that we do to each other, we don't ask us to open our brains so that we can debug each other. Right? So, yes, please.
So, can you elaborate the Tesla autopilot case a little bit more? So, what's the problem there and what's the ideal situation?
So, I think in the case of Tesla, I think first of all, they're not even trying to get anywhere near the robot, the car, actually trying to cooperate, and collaborate with you. What they basically said is, it's a system that will completely drive for you, and so you don't really need to be in charge, but you always have to be in charge. And that just doesn't make sense for humans. Either I'm paying attention all the time, or I'm playing games, in which case I can't come back to full attention in milliseconds. Milliseconds is what that poor guy who had a car which could not differentiate between a white truck and the white sky had. And so it was just a bad model of human competence. In those cases, if you're making those kinds of assumptions, you probably shouldn't even try to have human in the loop. You just say, I drive. And you're anyway dead, you're toast. And so if I'm a bad car, then you will be under the truck anyway. Why unnecessarily make you think that you have a solution, you have an option? If you came back for 3 milliseconds quickly when I put this little thing. That's the whole point of making it. But I mean, in general, you want AI systems may not necessarily be going under the trucks, but they may actually be trying to work with you to actually solve a problem collaborating. And in those cases, this model in general. That's like a simplest kind of model where I think maybe Alan actually can come back to full attention in 3 milliseconds, and maybe he assumed everybody can do that. Any other? Yes?
Slightly a deviation from what you're asking. You just said a minute ago about how the model gives feedback and the human in control can now say, well, maybe you shouldn't do that, right? So there's a lot of conversation about, even in the strategies that you showed, the next one after human-computer interaction was about social impact and the ethics evolving. Do you see that this possible understanding of the model and using the model to, using explainable model,
Explainable behavior.
right, to actually help solve problems like the trolley problem and actually produce...
I don't know, first of all, I mean, some of these problems don't have solutions. Like trolley problem has no solution. These are very different ethical models, and all you might want your AI systems to understand is whether you particularly have, what your preferences are in those cases. But certainly there is some aspects of, I don't necessarily think that I can solve the social impact issues. I'm just saying that ignoring that people are, that an AI system ignoring that humans are modeling it, and then they are modulating their behavior based on those models, will lead to inefficient interaction between the systems. Okay, it could be a bad, I mean, it could, once you might want to go either extremes. One is I will deliberately mislead you into thinking what my abilities are. I will deliberately get you in line with my abilities. One is cooperation. One is deception. Actually, I mean, I don't know if you people understand that. Autistic savants are known to be essentially the same level of intelligence, except they tend to miss the social intelligence. There's this beautiful statement in the boy who mistook the dog thing that, at any given point of time, one thing happened, a trillion things didn't happen. How do you lie? Lying involves deciding which of those trillion things that didn't happen actually happened. We do it all the time. That's why we have big brains. We are essentially able to pick the right lie that will help our case, right? And to some extent, that's the deliberate one. Okay, so ignoring basically will make AI systems sort of like autistic savants, which is, at one level, they can still do a lot of useful things, but they would certainly not be able to have effective interactions with most, quote unquote, neurotypical humans who tend to have specific ways of modeling each other. Okay? Anything else? If not, Anata is going to take over.
Thank you, Rao. So in terms of a concrete example that we can work with, so for that I'll be introducing this domain, urban search and rescue domain. So here the idea is that the robot is deployed to a disaster area, and then there are two agents in the domain. One is an internal agent, that is the robot who is operating in the environment, and then there is an external agent, which is the human commander who is observing the robot from the outside. And the robot can perform several tasks here. One is surveying particular rooms. So that is indicated by the red beacon. So here each cell is a room. Some are blocked due to the disaster, and some have the red beacon. So the robot has to go and survey these rooms. Then it has to identify survivors. It also has to perform triage on the survivors. As Rao talked about this, the models of the commander and the robot can diverge. So the robot may have like a more updated model of the disaster area, and therefore the robot's optimal plan in the environment might not necessarily match the human's expectations of its behavior. And therefore interpretable behavior is necessary for the robot. So in this I'll talk about three types of behaviors. So as Rao said, interpretable behavior is necessary. And explicable behavior is one way to make the robot act in a way that the human expects it to act. Legible behavior allows the robot to convey some important information to the human. And predictable behavior allows it to act accurately in a way that the human can anticipate its future behavior. So now let's first look at explicable behavior. So even though the robot and the human have agreed upon a task at hand, the expectations may still diverge. And this may lead to the human getting surprised, that may increase the cognitive load on the human, may lead to the human distrusting the robot. And therefore, the robot has to conform to the human's expectations. And one way to do this is to account for the human's mental model while it computes its plan. So the example that we saw before, so instead of doing the optimal behavior here, the robot can do something like this, and now it is conforming to the human's expectation of what it should have done. So there are two ways of generating explicable behavior. First of all, in order to generate the explicable behavior, the robot needs the human's mental model. And the human's mental model can be either learned separately or it can be given a priori to the robot. So this approach now looks at a scenario where the human's mental model is available to the robot. But the robot cannot directly plan with the human's mental model, because the plan that is optimal in the human's mental model may not necessarily be either feasible or it may be very expensive for the robot to execute. Therefore, it has to find a plan in its own model that is closest to the human's expected plan. And it can do that by finding a plan that minimizes plan distance with respect to the expected plans. And this can be done either using a cost difference model, that is a plan that has the same cost as the optimal plan in the human's mental model, or it can be done using action set difference, that is the same set of actions in both the plans, or it can be done using multiple different distances like this. So now let's look at another approach. Here, the human's mental model is not necessarily available to the robot upfront. And therefore, it cannot compute this distance function. Therefore, it cannot minimize the distance with respect to the human's optimal or expected plan. But what we can do here instead is use a labeling scheme. So given the set of tasks in a domain, a human can associate each action with a task, each action that the robot performs with a task. And if the human cannot associate an action with any of the tasks, then we say that action is inexplicable. And so basically we can learn the sequentiality between the actions, what is the pattern that makes most sense to the human. And this can be done using conditional random fields, and so not the whole model does not need to be learned. Only this pattern can be used by the robot to then use it as a heuristic to generate the plans. So now that we have seen explicable behavior, let's look at what legible behavior is about. So essentially, in order to improve the team performance, the robot has to communicate its intentions and objectives to the human. One way would be to explicitly communicate this, but that might involve some complexities. Say the cost of the communication, or say the time it takes to communicate things, and also what it needs to communicate. So these are some complexities. And therefore, one way to avoid this would be for the robot to implicitly convey the intentions while it's doing its behavior. And that exactly is legible behavior. So let's look at how this works. So here we have a robot, and the robot has two medical kits that it wants to, there are two medical kits in the environment, and it wants to say it is picking up one of those. So generally in legible settings, the human knows the set of candidate goals that the robot has, but does not know which goal the robot is going for. That is the true goal of the robot. And therefore, the objective is to convey that goal implicitly through the behavior. And one way to do this is basically, whenever the robot moves, the human updates its belief on the candidate set of goals. And one way to do this is basically move right and indicate that it's going to the rightmost medical kit. And thus, the robot can reduce the human's uncertainty over the set of possible goals in the domain. So now let's look at online legible behavior. So here the idea is that the human should quickly and confidently be able to identify the robot's true goal. And these approaches generally use a probabilistic goal recognition system to update the human's belief after each observation is received. The human may or may not have full observability of the robot's actions. And so the idea is basically to choose actions that increase the posterior probability of the true goal whenever the observations are given. So now let's look at one type of online legible behavior. This approach, legible robot motion. This approach looks at legibility from the point of view of motion planning. So here we have an example where the robot is trying to pick up one of the two medical kits. And it wants to convey which one it's going to pick to the human. And one way to do that is to take this really roundabout motion. In doing so, it tells the human that the rightmost one is the one that it's going for. So the idea here is to find a trajectory endpoint between the start state and the goal, which maximizes the posterior probability of the true goal. And sooner the true goal is recognized by the human, the better is the legibility of the trajectory. This is another type of online legible behavior, and here this work looks at legibility from the point of view of task planning. So here in this example, the robot may have two tasks. One of the tasks is surveying the rooms, and another task is performing triage on the survivor. So by going for the med kit, the robot can indicate that it's trying to perform triage instead of doing the surveying. And here the idea is that the distance between the target belief which has maximum posterior probability for the true goal, the distance between that belief and the current belief needs to be reduced. So actions which reduce the distance between these beliefs are preferred, and those are the transparent actions here. Now let's look at offline goal legibility. So the idea here is that the observer only receives the observations at the end of the entire sequence. And this work actually generalizes the problem of goal legibility. First of all, it generalizes it in terms of partial observability of the human, and another is the amount of goal legibility achieved. So by partial observability, what I mean is, say the robot moves in the environment. Now the human does not know which of the move actions it took, whether it went north, south, east, west. So it knows that, the human knows that the robot moved, but the human does not know which way. So basically the human can update its belief by looking at the previous belief and the observation received. So here now, let's look at an example to concretize this. So the robot has to survey a room and also treat a victim, but it has to convey which victim it is trying to treat. So if the robot first performs the surveying action, then both the victims are now equidistant from the robot's position. So if the robot makes 3 move steps, it's not clear which victim did it treat. But instead, if the robot first treats the victim that it wants to treat, then it's very clear which victim it treated, because now it just did 2 move actions and then perform a triage action. And so this is the idea of goal legibility. The idea is to minimize the number of candidate goals possible in the observer's final belief. And say limit it with some number, say j. So at most j candidate goals possible in the set of total goals. So this approach generates a behavior that satisfies a predetermined amount of goal legibility. So you can decide first first only how much you want to be legible and then generate a plan with that. So that would be a J-legible plan. So that's about legibility. So now let's look at predictability and what it entails. So if the human cannot predict or anticipate the robot's behavior, there can be accidents in the workplace. And this has led to all the industrial robots being kept in cages. But this can decrease the overall team performance. And therefore, if the robot behaves in a way that the human can easily understand, then that can help engender trust in the robot. And that is what predictable robot behavior is about. So in this setting, generally the human knows the goal of the robot, but does not know which plan will the robot take to achieve that goal. For example, here we have a medkit that the robot wants to pick, but it can go left or right. But the robot has to act in a way that the human can anticipate it. So let's say that the human expects the robot to be rational and therefore to take like an optimal plan. And the observer again updates its belief on the set of valid plans when the observer receives observations. So now when the robot moves right, it is clear to the human that the robot is taking the rightmost path. And therefore by synthesizing predictable behavior, the robot can reduce humans' uncertainty over the set of behaviors possible to achieve the goal. So let's now look at predictable robot motion. This work approaches the predictability notion from the motion planning point of view. Here there is a single medkit, but which trajectory will the robot take? There can be multiple ways of accessing the medical kit. The human assumes that the robot is rational and therefore might take a short length trajectory, and that is what predictability is about. So here essentially you're trying to optimize some sort of metric, and that metric can be anything. It could be trajectory length, it could be something else. So but you have to identify what that metric is and then basically minimize it. Now let's look at predictability. This is a type of online predictability behavior. So the key idea here is that given the first T actions in a plan, they should foreshadow the rest of the actions in the plan. So for example, here there are 3 rooms that the robot should survey. But which way will the robot go? But if the robot takes the first right step, then it is clear that the robot will just take the rest of the plan like that. So the idea here is to maximize the posterior probability of the T+1 actions to the end, given the start state, the goal state, and the first T actions. And therefore, a T-predictable planner finds an action sequence that maximizes that posterior probability. So now let's talk about offline plan predictability. So this approach is again offline. Here the human has again partial observability, so that means the robot may move, but the human does not know which direction the robot moved in. And the human again updates its belief after all the observations are received. So the idea here is that the human should be able to guess which actions the robot took. And these actions, which plan the robot took basically. And so there may be multiple plans that may be consistent with the same observation sequence that achieve the goal that was decided upon. We will see with an example what this means. So this work generalizes the problem of conveying the actions to the human. So for example, here you have a robot that has to perform triage on the 2 survivors. there are two medkits. So which medkit will the robot pick? It wants to convey the actions to the human. So it will pick this medkit because picking the other medkit will result in the robot taking multiple actions. For example, going like this, going like this, going like this. So there's multiple paths that may lead to that medkit. So this one results in just 2 plans. And therefore the idea here is to limit the number of plans and also to limit the similarity between, to limit the diversity between these plans. So basically to increase the similarity between plans. And so the idea is to generate M plans that are at most D distance away from each other, which is called M similar plans. And this can be again done. The distance can be computed using some sort of plan distance matrix, like action set distance, which gives the difference of actions between the 2 plans. Okay, so that's about predictability. And now Tathagata will talk about the rest of the things. Till then I can take any questions you have.
All right. So far, as a brief update to the schedule, so I am going to cover some ways to explain instead of be explicable to the human. And for the break, I will just go into the basics of that process, and then Sarath will take over after that into more details on how those basics can be extended, as well as other forms of explanations. So, so far we have been talking about this idea of being conforming to what the human in the loop is expecting from us. And the reason we want to do that is because if the models differ and the robot is doing the best it can, it will still be not what the human would be expecting. And so we call them inexplicable plans. It turns out that the robot really has 2 options. If the models are different, you can be explicable. That's what we did till now. But you can also provide explanations in terms of those model differences. And that's what we will explore now. How to explain your plans in terms of these model differences so the human in the loop can make sense of what you have done. So before we go into the details of how to do that, let's look at a demo. So we go back to this search and rescue use case where there is a robot that's internal to the scene. And there's an external supervisor who is providing it goals to achieve. And so the external has some sense of what's going on in the scene, but only through the eyes of what the robot has done. And that means that the models that they started with, in our case, that's the environment, the model of the environment, that has changed during the course of that operation. And so, for example, new paths would have opened up. Or the older paths that are already available, they might have been blocked. So, so the red plan here is the optimal plan that the human is expecting from their current model. However, that path is already blocked, and so so the robot can't actually do that. But the green one that's shortest in the robot's model is not doable in the human's model. So the robot has a choice to make here. Either it can be trying to be as close as possible to the red plan, and that would be the explicable plan, or it can do the best plan it can, which is the green one, and explain why it can do that in terms of the 2 model differences. So the 2 model differences here is that these 2 locations are no longer blocked, so it can actually go ahead and do that shorter plan. And so from the human's point of view, this is what it will look like. So in the more explicable plan, the robot is making more expensive operations, but the plan, but from the human's point of view, is looking at a plan that's much closer to the shortest plan that the human could have computed. So in this case, this is a much more expensive plan for the robot, but it's a less expensive plan and more explicable plan to the human. In the other case, the robot is providing explanations, so those are the top corner, and providing it the human updates on what has changed in the map. And so with those updates, the resulting plan is optimal. And so the reason why we want to do this, because explicable plans are not always possible. So if you have some sense of what the human's expectation is, in order to conform to them, the plans that you will come up with may be very expensive or may not be possible at all. And so the explanations is really a complementary capability towards conforming to expectations. And one of the things that we want to highlight, as I was saying up front, that you can't explain based on your own models if it's not a debugging situation. If you're interacting with humans, they would have their own expectations. And so the explanations shouldn't be just a soliloquy in your own model. It should be addressing what those expectations are and how those expectations are wrong. And so the explanation process really becomes a process of bringing those, the mental model closer to what the robots believe of the real model is. And we call that model reconciliation because the models are coming closer during the explanation process. So briefly, the setup is that the robot has come up with the best possible plan that it can. And the explanation is an update to the human's mental model, so that the human cannot come up with a better plan. And so if you are enforcing that the current plan is optimal in the updated model, that's sort of a conservative estimate because that guarantees that the human cannot come up with a better plan. But the general idea is that we want to come up with explanations that update the mental model so that the human cannot come up with better points. So if they're asking why this plan or why not this other plan, you want to make sure they cannot come up with more things like that. And there's been a lot of work looking at the different properties of explanations, not just in planning or AI, across the board. And three of the properties that show up often is this idea of social, contrastive, and selective properties. The idea being, the social property is basically this idea of modeling the human mental model. The two interesting parts are being contrastive and selective. So contrastive means that you are not explaining just the plan, but you're also explaining why other things were not possible in place of that plan. And so for us, by ensuring that the human cannot come up with a better plan, it's contrasting against all possible foils. However, it turns out that there are many ways to generate that model update. And that's why we get into the selective properties. How do you come up with the set of model updates that can preserve these properties? And it turns out that there are many ways, and some of these have properties that kind of conflict with each other. So the few types of explanations that we have looked at in our work, we call them, so the four basic explanations we looked at are model patch explanations, plan patch explanations, and minimal explanations of two types. What this does is they are preserving different properties of the plan. So, for example, a plan patch explanation, all it does is to make sure that with the updates, the plan is feasible in the updated mental model. Whereas the minimally complete and monotonic explanations make sure that the plan is not only feasible, but is also the best plan in the updated model. So in this example, so this is a fetch robot, and it moves and it can pick up stuff. But it has this weird property that it cannot move unless you tuck its arm back. Because it's sort of tall enough, so the center of gravity kind of shifts. And so it's not safe to move while the arm is out. However, for people generally interacting with robots, you don't expect those extra constraints for specific robots. So you would think that if it wants to move, it will just move with the current state. And so if you ask the robot to move, you will get extra actions like the one in red that you wouldn't expect from your expectation of the robot. And so, so that plan that the robot comes up with is longer than your expected plan. And if you ask why not this shorter plan, it has to explain to you why the tough action was necessary. And what these explanations are trying to do is to surface different parts of in the internal model of the robot to the human that it thinks that the human doesn't know. And with those updates, that plan will be the best plan possible. The point of minimality here is that we want to ensure that the differences in the model that we actually surface to the human are as little as possible and are as relevant as possible to the current plan. And so there are different versions of minimality, like just minimally complete explanations just give you the minimal explanation, the shortest explanation that preserves optimality of the plan, whereas monotonic ones also make sure that further explanations from that would not invalidate previous explanations. So these are different properties that you can look at by generating explanations. Some of them actually conflict with each other, so some of them are easier to generate, but do not have the optimality property. Some of them have the optimality property, but they are way more complex, so you might have to trade that off. And the way we go about generating these explanations is what we call model-based search. So you have your own model where you have plan, and you have the mental model of the human in the loop. That is your expectation of the mental model. And you're planning the space of all the models that come from the differences in those two models. So yeah, so for example, if you're given a plan and you want to compute the minimal number of model updates to make sure that that plan is optimal, you can start from the mental model and make unit model updates until you get to the point that that plan is optimal. So that's where the search is terminated, and you get the minimally complete explanation. For minimally monotonic explanations, if you want to make sure that explanation is always valid, you can start the model space search from the other side, and then start removing model differences until you get to the point where again the given plan is optimal. And that gives you the monotonic explanations. Because after that, all the models would be preserving that optimality property. I won't go into the details of the algorithms per se, but rather into some interesting phenomena that we observed when we tried out these different explanations with humans in the loop. So what we did was we took the same search and rescue scenario and took out the human's interface to the setting as a gamified environment on the browser, and asked people to, in one setting, we asked them to provide explanations so we can match them to what we are generating. And in another setting, we asked them to rate the explanations that we are generating. So the first experiment was about figuring out that the different explanation types that we looked at in literature actually correspond to anything that the humans themselves come up with. And it turns out that most of the time it did. So the two conditions there were how much communication they had. So whether they had whether they could communicate as much as they wanted versus whether they had to minimize that. And it turns out that when there was a constraint of minimizing the amount of information they were giving, most of the time they shifted towards the minimal explanations that we saw. But if there was no constraint, they were giving much more information than the minimal one. Also, an interesting part here is the green bar, which is rated as other. So those are explanations that did not fit any of the ones that we looked at. And in our HRA paper, we actually go into more details of how those work out. From the point of view of actually evaluating explanations that we do come up with. So in the second part of the study, we showed them explanations generated through those algorithms and asked them whether they could identify the right properties of the plan based on what the explanations were intended. So for example, if we are providing minimally complete explanations, the humans should be able to tell apart a suboptimal plan from an optimal plan. And so, and again, in most of the situations, they were accurately able to identify the right properties of the plan, given the kind of explanation that was being used. So that's an overview of what model reconciliation looks like. I will go into a way to combine these two kinds of behavior. But before that, if there are questions, I'm happy to take them. All right. So, so far we have looked at these two different ways of generating behavior. One being explicable to the human in the loop through behavior, and the other being actually communicating explanations in the form of model updates. But what if we could actually fold that explanation, the consideration of explaining the plan, into the reasoning process itself? And it turns out that humans always do this, right? So it's well known that if you ask humans to explain their plans, they will actually make different and at times better decisions. And in general, if you're observed, you change your behavior based on that. So the point of this is to fold back some of those behavioral traits into the robot's plan generation process itself. And so from the traditional, like the classical planning setting, where you're given a planning problem and you're finding a plan from that. The human error planning problem becomes more complex because you're not just finding a plan given a model, you're finding what's the best model to plan in, given your own model and your understanding of where the human is. So, so the solution to the human error planning problem not only includes a plan, but also some directive on how to interact with the human in terms of that plan and the differences in their plans. So the way we combine these two behaviors is still by doing model-space search, but we don't start with a plan like in explanations. We start with just the model difference and a description of the planning problem, and we still continue the model-space search, but we have a combined objective now. We want to minimize the cost of explanations as well as the cost of being inexplicable. And the cost of explanations you can take a proxy by doing just the length of an explanation, for example. Whereas the cost of inexplicability is basically the departure from optimality in the human's mental model. And combining these two, you can get behavior that's half explainable, half explanations based on how costly you want to make them. And the outcomes of combining these two behaviors is that you can actually generate explanations that are shorter than the previous explanations that we looked at, even shorter than the minimal explanations. Because basically now you are making plans that are easier to explain. So if many plans available to you, and some may require more explanations given what you think the human expectation is, you can generate ones that will require the least explanation. And it also gets us out of the explicability only point of view, which may not be feasible or it may be too costly. So going back to the studies that we were looking at on surfacing the interface to the search and rescue scenario to the end users. We did similar studies for the balancing of explicability and explanations itself. And it turns out that humans did ask for explanations around 30% of the time when plans were explicable. So these are times when they shouldn't have asked for explanations, but they did. And also in 30% of the cases in the blue bar, they should have asked for an explanation but didn't. And that kind of points to the fact that we didn't actually consider the inferential capability of the human in those cases. And they couldn't actually, maybe they couldn't compute the actual quality of the plans as the planner could. But in general, you do see the trend that inexplicable plans explanations are way less sought after. So from the robot's point of view, you can reduce the amount of the cost you're incurring by making this balanced approach. But from the human's point of view, there is really no difference between balanced and inexplicable plans because both of them will include parts of it that you cannot explain with your model. So it's more for the robot to balance the cost of its plans. And the interesting part is that if you look at how different people individually responded to these differences, some would be more risk-taking, while others wouldn't. So that also kind of motivates why you look at these settings individually for individual users, and you can tune those balancing behavior toward the individual needs of the humans. So that's about balancing explicability only. In general, you can talk about balancing across any of the interpretable behaviors that Anara talked about. So you could, if you want to be predictable, also you want to be cost optimal in your own model, you could balance that. So in general, there's a whole what we call the landscape of interpretable behavior, and you could balance different kinds of those behaviors with your own cost model. And so we will look at two particular cases of that. But if there are questions about balancing, I'm happy to take it as well. All right. So one of the applications that we look at is this idea of communicating future behavior using mixed reality. And the reason we want to use communication in this form is because in explicability, the communication of model differences or dealing with model differences was done through behavior, and that has some cost. And so what mixed reality allows you to do is to project out the future intention that you don't have to actually do. So you don't incur the cost of doing actions, but you can project to the human in advance what may or may not happen. So the setting looks something like this. There's a robot in the loop, and it's projecting out parts of its internal model to the human in the form of symbols. And you are interacting with those symbols to change the robot's behavior. So you can do this at both at the time of execution as well as plan generation. If you're doing it at the time of execution, let's say you have a bunch of plans that you can execute, and the human is not sure what to do. So this is the case. The human is not sure what the robot is going to do. So this is the case of predictability, and you want to disambiguate your future behavior. One of the things you can do is to compute the different aspects of all the possible plans, and and select a plan that has the most disambiguating features. So for example, if you have 5 plans and one of them has no common action with all of the other ones, you can use that to, you can project that future action. And that gives you the way to disambiguate possible features. And so it's the execution time problem is just a problem of finding the most disambiguating future actions. So from the point of view of projections, so in this example, we were asking the robot to build different words. So there's like a proxy to an assembly domain. And what the projection at the bottom right corner is telling you is that R will be picked up at some point in the plan. And given the possible solutions to this problem, that single R can tell you which word will come up later. So this is a case where you can disambiguate feature actions using projection actions. And of course, this doesn't give you the entire control over the execution. You can still come back and change the plan itself, because given the vocabulary of symbols, you may not be actually able to disambiguate all possible plans by just projecting. So in that case, you give the control back to the human to change your behavior by specifically interacting with the holograms that you're projecting. So suppose you have projected a future action that the human does not want you to do. They can interact with the symbols and make you change your plan. So as an example, so in this case, there's a So in this case, the robot wants to pick up the green block, but the human is intervening and asking it to change. And so it's replanning online to make sure that it uses a plan that does not use that specific thing. So, so in this case again, the robot is projecting ahead, but the human has a chance to come back and change the behavior based on those projections. And from the point of view of balancing, so similar to the case of balancing explanations and explicability, you can balance predictability and with your cost model as well. And so similar to the previous case, you can look at the search time. So this is not at execution, you still haven't generated a plan. You're trying to make sure that you disambiguate the plan to the best possible extent. So you can have sort of a entropy consideration, hold back the uncertainty in which plan you are going to proceed into the cost model, and use that to compute your plan. It turns out to be very hard to compute. So we looked at very simpler compute versions of this planning problem using landmarks to find proxies to that particular cost. But the general takeaway is that you can fold back these execution time contingencies into the reasoning process by folding those predictability, explicability measures into your cost model. And again, the reason that we wanted to use modalities like mixed reality is because it lets you not do more expensive action to convey your model details to the human. So it not only does it allow you to foreshadow or project into the future, it allows you to save on the cost of doing those actions. And so, in terms of folding these capabilities into the reasoning process, in this case, the robot is actually making longer plans based on the symbols that it has. So using those symbols, it can disambiguate those plans to the extent possible. So that means that if there are options that are more projection friendly or easier to disambiguate at execution time, at generation time, you can generate those plans, taking those considerations in. So, of course, any form of communication can be folded into the reasoning process. So one of the papers that we will present in AAAI later this week is about finding out a general form of this communicative actions. So it could be any form of communication. So it could be actually explicit explanations, it could be projections, it could be explicable behavior, and we find a unified framework to do that. One of the interesting outcomes of that is that we were able to use epistemic planning framework to find a very computationally friendly representation to fold these considerations into the planning process. So if you're interested in extensions of that, please come by the talk during the main session. So that's a wrap of different kinds of balancing behavior, balancing different kinds of interpretability with the cost model of the robot. So we'll come back to the extension of this after the break, but if you have questions, please feel free to ask.
So I think otherwise the break is until 4 o'clock.
Right.
Yeah. Trickling in, so actually there were a couple of questions that somebody was asking, and then absolutely thought I'll bring this up to you guys too as an interesting exercise, and then maybe there are other questions, and then we will get started with what we planned. As usual, we have lots and lots to cover, but on the other hand, we'll cover what you can understand. That makes more sense. So one of the interesting questions that somebody was asking me earlier, and which is a reasonable question, which is, if AI systems have the ability to model the mental state of the humans, will they be easier to foil too? And it's actually true, because if they can lie to you, you can lie to them. I mean, if the systems completely ignore your presence, you trying to kind of feign, headache or I'm feeling sad, etc. doesn't matter, because they're really ignoring it. If on the other hand they're paying attention to you, you can indeed foil the system more. And so the question of if the human in the loop is adversarial rather than just trying to cooperate with the computer, then it does increase the ability, the foil would be, the ability to foil the system will be higher. So even without real mental modeling, just even acknowledging the presence of a human in the loop, for example, you've seen this little cartoon and these videos where kids will realize that the robot doesn't want to hit people, so it tries to stop, and so the kids will just keep going in front of the robot, this side to that side, and the robot doesn't get to go anywhere. Whereas a robot that sort of runs over people would have reached its goal, right? And so I think we have to understand that modeling mental states of others will make us vulnerable too. Because if you understand that, for example, in social interaction, right, if you understand people's mental states, etc., and if your friend wants to kind of play with you, they can act sad, and then you will start giving them all sorts of advantages, and then so you basically got taken advantage of. So that can happen at the AI system. So we're just right now looking at the first basically the second order level, which is AI system realizing that human has a model of it, but not necessarily adversarial. But this issue of what happens when there is adversarial humans in the loop would be quite interesting. And we know that there are adversarial humans in the loop. I mean, take the tweetbot, for example, is a classic case. And I mean, it's not, I don't know why I keep keeping the Microsoft examples, but they too thought, people are nice, we'll put this tweetbot up and it'll learn good stuff, and then, those of you who remember what happened, within I think, less than 24 hours, it became a raving Nazi and sexist and racist, etc., and started saying things because people basically were playing with it by essentially making it learn completely wrong things. So I think that is an aspect that actually does exist. Adversarial attacks would be more possible on systems that can actually model it. But then you will have to model the second level as to are you really sad, or are you acting sad to get things out of me? That's where all this extra regress comes in. But that's something that somebody asked, and I just wanted to point that out. Are there anything else that anybody had general question on the overall thing that happened about the techniques that were covered, etc.? So, if not, then basically, Sharath is going to kind of look at a variety of extensions for the model reconciliation that include a lot of outsiders work on the work. That's not necessarily done in my group, but it winds up being very much relevant to the overall program, and including inferential differences and so on. And then we'll continue.
Thank you. So you guys can hear me, right? Okay. So as I was saying, I'll start by talking about some of the work that's been done on extending this framework of model reconciliation. I'm using the word extensions kind of loosely because in some cases it's more about concretizing it for a specific settings, which makes it amenable to maybe better computation, or makes it easier to look at other approaches. So you can just think of the work that's been done since the model reconciliation thing in terms of this model space search. You can talk about the different parts of this search space that has been looked at by people and kind of changed. Most of the work has been focused on this part because this is one of the core parts of that approach, right? The fact that you know the human mental model. Usually, when you're reconciling, you kind of have an idea of what they expect and where is this expectation coming from, right? So there has been work what happens when the models of the human is incomplete? What happens when you know the model is an approximation, a model is an abstraction of your current model? What happens when you don't want to learn the full model? Can we get away by learning some kind of proxies for these kind of models? What happens when there are multiple observers? Do things change? Like what happens when there is a vocabulary difference? Isn't that you are not, the human isn't thinking of the problem in the same terms as the system. How do you bridge that gap, right? So, and then you have these kind of works that looks at applying model reconciliation in like, so the original work was like looked at in like a planning domain kind of a setting, but people have also looked at it more in like, when you have to think about the knowledge that the human robot has in terms of like logic program or knowledge bases, how does reconciliation play out? What if it's like simple task allocation models where you're just talking about the cost of different tasks? And then what if it's all represented as MDPs and stuff like that? And you can also talk about how do you order these explanations, right? You don't want to just dump it, you might just want to give it piece by piece. So how do you do that? So there's like a bunch of work. Because of time limitations, I won't be able to go through all of them, but I'll try to focus on more the human model, like the relaxations done in the human mental model space. But of course, we can, like, if you have any questions, just stop me. If there's something you guys think is interesting, we can just focus on that. Okay. So the first assumption we can relax is, knowing that for reconciling, in the original work, what we assumed is we have the model, right? We know exactly what the human is expecting from the robot, right? And this is maybe, for now, let's assume it's like specified in some representation scheme that's comparable to the robots, right? Obviously, in some cases, we have access to it, as we discussed in the case of the USAR, we have access to it. In some cases, it can be learned, but even learning mental models is a hard process. You don't get a lot of data, and it might not be always possible to learn a complete model, right? So can we get away with less? What happens when you want to explain and you only have incomplete models? So here I'm using the word incomplete models in a very specific sense, in the sense that there are parts of the model I know. That is, I know the human knows things that I have, like the robot has the effect holding X. But the human might think that the robot has these additional preconditions, right? So basically the robot doesn't really exactly know if those preconditions are actually part of the human's model. Just a quick thing, I assume people here are comfortable with precondition effects kind of a representation scheme. If not, you can just stop me and we can maybe go over it a little bit. So what these kind of incomplete models actually capture is a set of possible models, right? There are like just these two preconditions, like possible preconditions, correspond to 4 possible models, right? So some where these preconditions are not there, some where all of them are there, some of them, one of them is there. So you basically, what we are now dealing with is, instead of having one mental model for the human, now you have a possible set of mental models for the human. So a way to handle these kind of conditions is what we might call a conformal explanation. So what you can do is basically come up with a single explanation. So just to clarify, explanation here, when I'm saying these slides, I specifically mean information about the robot model that the human was previously did not have, or had some incorrect beliefs about or something. So here, when I'm saying the system gives an explanation, it's giving information about its model, right? In this case, it could be like saying things like robot has this precondition, or robot action A has this effect, right? So to come back, conformal explanation is one that works for the entire space of models, right? Like I was showing you, there is like 4 possible models. No matter which of these the human has, you have to come up with one single set of information that would work for all of them. So I won't get into the details because you use the structure of the problem to kind of simplify it. But just want to point out this interesting detail that there's a reason why I put incomplete models first and multiple observers. Because what happens when there are multiple observers, right? So let's say there is like an engineer, there is a foreman, and whatever. They might have different expectations about the robot because of their background and what they have experience about. And what happens is, if the robot is trying to explain its plan to all of the users, and it's trying to set up a common ground, it should, in some sense, try to come up with an explanation that would work for everyone. So what we basically can do is we can then compile these kind of multi-observer cases into a case of these kind of annotated models. again, not going into the details, but hopefully you all agree it's possible. Now, the other thing I won't again go into too much detail is that here there's also a possibility of contingent explanation, right? So if it's just about uncertain models, I can give you a lot of information and cover all the bases, or I can ask you questions about what you know, and then use that to kind of tailor my explanations to more personal ones. Okay, so that was the work done on incomplete models. The next thing is, it's a kind of a similar case where we don't know the human model, but we know it's an abstraction of the original robot model. You can kind of think of it in the sense that the human knows certain facts about the world, but may not be an expert. They don't know all the constraints that are involved, may not know all the details, but their mental model can be captured as some abstraction over this robot model. And what that could mean is, basically, even though we don't have the exact model, we know the space of possible models, because we can start with a concrete robot model and create the possible abstraction. For now, let's assume I know how to create that abstraction and stuff like that. So what I can do after this is basically, I know the human's model lies somewhere here, right? And then now the thing is, I need to first figure out where exactly it lies. So this is like a sample lattice of such abstractions, but yeah. So first I need to kind of place where the human lies in this lattice. So the way we are doing, especially did it in that paper, is we were looking at cases where the goal of explanation was not to ensure optimality, but rather we were specifically looking at cases where the person was asking questions. Okay? These questions are like contrasted questions that Tadagata kind of mentioned, where basically the person is asking is, okay, this plan is all right, but I was expecting X. That X can be some constraints over the plan, or it can be fully specified plans itself, right? And what that lets us do is we can kind of now place in the lattice where those kind of plans are possible. So now this means we can now kind of localize where the human is, and then we can figure out what information we have to give to take them out of this region where there are possible confusion into a region where those confusions are resolved. So here the model reconciliation is about giving more details, right? So you have the human have this abstract model, and then you're giving these additional details so that you have more concrete model where the original confusion that they had is kind of resolved.
Actually, what is that that you are abstracting? What are you abstracting? So are you maintaining the same vocabulary, right?
Yes, so this is not a vocabulary different cases. It's the same vocabulary.
Changing the effect and the precondition?
So we, in this paper, the specific scheme we went with was a syntactic projection of fluents out of the thing. So if let's say we are projecting out holding disappears throughout the model. So it basically allows for more possibilities. So the idea is the user doesn't know about the property called holding. They don't know how that affects the different actions. So here the model reconciliation is telling the human that here is a property called holding, right? That's true in the initial state, and this is needed for this action as a precondition, and this is not met in your imaginary plan you gave to me, and so it will never work out. So that's the kind of explanation we looked at in that particular work.
You are still assuming that the states that the human has are the same as the one that the robot has?
Well, same in the sense that it might still...
of fluents.
Yeah, yeah. The fluents are basically, their state might be have less fidelity in the sense that it's like a cluster of different states, right? So the point is there might be a robot state that they can't distinguish because they don't have the information.
So one of the things, just regarding your question, he will at some point of time get to the point where the vocabulary is actually different, and so you will wind up having to translate, but much of this machinery will still be relevant once the translation occurs. The translation requires learning the representation, but after that, much of this machinery will still again be useful.
I'm asking this because this is probably much harder than NP, right? Because you have belief states, so the human has belief states over what the robot does, so this is going to be exponential.
Yeah.
X time.
So important point here is the fact that the NP hardness result is over fully specified plans. So this turns into a weighted set covering issue. So the point is like when you have fully specified plans, and all of these models are classical planning models, if introducing one fluent will resolve a model. And you can actually see that it basically just turns into weighted set covering. So you have the set of fluents, and I say that introducing this fluents will resolve F1, F2, F3. And this is something I can test without going down any of the other places. Because if I take a model where F1 is present, just F1, and the plan doesn't work, it will not work in any of the models where F1 is present. So that's why the NP hard result is it, because we were able to compile it into a weighted set covering. But again, so that's making the assumption that the abstraction scheme is basically like syntactic projection. So it's all classical planning model everywhere. They have fully specified plans. So we are not planning anything. At worst, we are validating this. So that's kind of. So yeah. And again, you can also see that it has submodularity and stuff like that. So because we can use greedy approximations for like weighted set covering here also, and it works out well. You have the same guarantees. Okay, the next part is all the things we've discussed till now, we have this idea of having access to a set of possible models. Right? Is it actually required that we have fully specified models in some form, right? But the question is, in the end, assuming no vocabulary difference, the information you are going to give are information from the robot's model, right? So you're going to tell the human that, okay, there is this robot model for action A, I have this precondition, or I don't have this precondition. So that is coming from the robot model. Why you actually need the human's mental model is to figure out the minimal one, right? You want to give concise explanation. You don't just want to dump your entire model. You want to know what they are expecting and just give the minimal information when possible, right? And the question is, can we do that without learning a model? One possibility is learn mappings of this one. Where this is like a very simplified setting where I'm assuming that you can explain tuples independently. As in, like, you take a tuple which is in the form of state, there's an action that happened there, and then there's a next state. This problem was formulated in the context of MDPs, that's why this kind of thing works out. But the point is, when you have this tuple, what we need is, given a set of possible information about the robot model, this is a fixed set, so we kind of know like what are the maximum amount of information you can give. Given a subset of information about the robot model and this tuple, is it going to be explicable or inexplicable to the human? So once we can learn a labeling model of this form, where we are going from tuples, information about the robot, whether a person would say after that, seeing that information, it's explicable or inexplicable, we can kind of approximate the search for explanation. Where instead of going through each possible mental model and kind of running this validation procedure, we can use this labeling model as a proxy to say, okay, if I give this much information, the behavior in question is going to be fine. And we can just kind of give the final explanation. So I don't know if you guys remember, but there was a version of this for the explicability case where they were just looking at the behavior. Now this is extending it so that you also include the explanatory messages. Cool. Okay, now I'll get to this section because I was more interested in this one. So, okay, we've talked all of this thing, right? Like there's modules and stuff like that. But to be fair, all of these systems, the robot might be thinking of these problems in very complex ways. And most people might have no idea of like the kind of terms in which the robot modeling might happen, unless they are expert. Of course, there are cases where people have written down these models, they make sense to them, and they're kind of trying to make sense. But a naive user might not be able to kind of understand everything. So before any of these model reconciliation can happen, we need to map it into the vocabulary space of the humans, right? And this is like a kind of a preliminary like step towards answering that question, how to do the mapping. So this work has kind of been like inspired by some of the work that's been done in machine learning, and some also done in like policy summarization, where you have this idea of concepts that people understand. Okay, let's not talk about what the robot is reasoning with, but rather let's ask the human what are the concepts they actually understand, right? And they can inform us about these concepts by giving us like examples of these concepts. So they can possibly look through, like give us example in the robot state and say, okay, for the concept robot holding medkit, this is a case where, well, this is a case where it's false. But there could be other cases where they'll say it's true, right? Once we have access to it, we can basically learn like a classifier that maps whatever high dimensional states into these concept space. And then we can kind of try to build models out using these concepts as a basis through like experiments, like where the robot could try out different things and kind of see what can it map its dynamics in those concept terms. So just in case people are familiar with, there's been work in like robotics community to kind of build these kind of high level representation, like from Dr. Gonzalez and stuff like that. So this also go in that way, but for them these symbols don't matter as far as like interpretability is concerned. Here the symbols are built specifically based on inputs from the user. You're asking them what makes sense to you. You're going to try to build a model, and when you can't build such models, you can go, our search is a very simple search. Our search kind of allows for detecting cases where you know that the current set of concepts that being provided to you is insufficient, and then you can just try to get the user to give you more concept to kind of like build more complex models. Okay, so that kind of brings us to the end of, well, not actually, I was completely, so next one is the kind of end of learning, like the works that have kind of relaxed the human mental model. Now we'll just look at few of the other aspects very briefly, we won't go into much detail. One of the things I was just talking about is like the ordering of the explanation, right? So currently in our work, it's all in the original model reconciliation work, the focus was mostly on coming up with the content. There was no real question of when it should be presented. Usually our assumption was if you can give it up front, so the person works with a really correct model, or maybe you can give it when the person asks for a question, right? But this could be a lot of information. One possibility is like kind of think about an online case where information is provided as required. And this particular work, which I think appeared in XAP 29, looked at like kind of try to define the needed part as like whenever the robot's prefix kind of deviates from what the human expects, right? So you have this, like think about a robot performing some plan and a person is observing. At a point where they're going to deviate, you're going to give them just enough information that the deviation makes sense, right? So that's the online aspect of this. They have some variations in it, but I won't probably go into it. And next one is like, as I was saying, there are works that have looked at using different kinds of models for model reconciliation. The kind of the process stays the same. There are details that change. For example, if you're talking about MDP, you might want to ask, okay, do I need to give enough information that my entire policy, like the robot's policy, is going to be optimal? Or is the human just observing me executing something? Then the entire policy doesn't matter, right? I just need to make sure that the current trace that they saw kind of makes sense. That means you can get away with less and stuff like that. And then there's there are works that have looked at like generalizing model reconciliation settings where there's just knowledge bases specified in some logic, and you're asking for explanation in terms of entailment of formulas. So here also there are like they've looked at different things like what they're calling model theoretic explanation, where explanation is just about give enough information that the formula is going to be entailed in the human's knowledge base. And then there is a proof theoretic explanation where they are actually going to give you a proof. Even a set of a rule set, they're going to give you a proof so that the human can also like prove the fact if required. Okay, so that's, and then there is also cases with the model reconciliation happens for task allocation. So it's a simpler case where the model mainly consists of cause, and it's about like the system is just basically coming up with a task allocation, and somebody could complain, right? Like because they don't really understand all the cause, say that okay, this seems unfair. I seem to have gotten the worst task, and this guy is getting such an easy task. So there, it's about like reconciling these cost differences. The interesting aspect here is you can give like some additional information. Like here in this paper, the authors looked at negotiation trees, so they can just walk you through what would happen if I had tried to give the task allocation that you want. You will see that okay, this person is going to complain and things like that. But we'll get more into how you can help people understand like decisions later when inference capabilities come into question. And that kind of covers the extensions of model reconciliation work. The next one is reconciling inferential differences. But before we get into that, are there any questions about something we discussed right now? Okay, the next question is, when a person is asking for an explanation for a plan, knowledge asymmetry is just part of the puzzle, right? Because the reason, even if the human knew everything about the model, knew all the detail and was an expert, they might still not be able to make sense of the plan because it could be quite complex. The problem might be like the space in which they have to think might be too large, and there may be very complex constraints, right? So helping people understand decisions thus means like more than just bridging this knowledge gap, but we have to also kind of bridge the inferential gap, right? So obviously there are ways like abstraction. In some ways, the earlier abstraction works also try to present simpler settings, like things in simpler settings, but there are also other approaches that have been kind of discussed in the literature, and many of them take this flavor of allowing people to ask more specific questions. They're basically going to interrogate the system as to why this specific decision was made, and the hope is to provide intuitive enough explanation so they can kind of make sense of the specific decision in question, right? And the other question is like, if the plan and the policy is complex enough, just giving it to the human is a challenge. Like they won't be able to make head or tails about what is the robot is trying to do. So there you can talk about things like visualizing the plan, verbalizing it, summarizing it, and those also we will try to cover. I don't know if we'll have time to cover it in details, but we'll just see. Okay, the first one is about, like I said, is about querying for decision rationale. I'll try to cover like at least one work each on the kind of questions they answer, right? So that's the way I'm dividing up, but I'm not saying these are the only works. Of course, there are a lot of them. Okay, the first thing is, why was an action chosen, right? Let's assume it's a classical planning setting, which is fully deterministic. The solutions are like sequential plans, right? And you've done this, robot has come up with this 200-step plan, and the user is asking, at step 20, why did the robot disable security alarms? Maybe the reason why it disabled it is because of some action that comes at step 150. Therefore, a person just going through the plan, it may be very hard to kind of make sense of it. So this work, this is actually kind of I think it's 2013 or 2014 work, tried to answer this in terms of causal links, right? So causal links are this very commonly, well, it was very commonly used before in like planning literature and stuff like that. So it basically, in a sense, intuitively you can think of, it kind of captures, I don't know. So if an action produces an effect that is used as a precondition for or a different action, you can think there's a causal link between these actions. Again, I'm making this huge assumption that everybody here understands preconditions, effects, and stuff like that. But please stop me if that's kind of confusing. But you can just think of to give an intuitive explanation. This action is required because it's contributing something for this action, right? But now the problem is it's a recursive thing. So you can, if the person says the step 20 is needed because it contributes something for step 150, then why is step 150 needed? So it can be a recursive thing, but thankfully all of this has to lead to the goal, and that's where you end up with. So what these explanation would be like a chain that starts from the action, goes to the action it actually contributes a causal link to, and then you can follow this all the way to the goal. The way that specific paper kind of tried to do it was turning it into like theorem proving in an axiomatic system, but I won't get into this details unless somebody is really interested. Now, the question is, now first thing we try to answer is why this action, right? A more general question, like Tadagata pointed out, is contrasted questions, where the questions are in the form of why P and not Q, right? And P and not Q are not necessarily just plans, right? The human is not just saying why this plan and not some other plan, but these could be just general constraints, right? So human might be asking, why did you choose a plan with this property when you could have chosen a plan with a different property? It's a very general class of things. And like some examples could be saying like, why action A and not action B? So here the human might not just mean replace action A with action B, but rather, why did you not choose a plan where action B was used and not action B? So you can think about these questions as kind of providing a constraints on the kind of solutions they were expecting. And the goal of explanation here is to kind of say why such plans were not selected. And this particular work, like, I think it again appeared in XAP 2019, kind of tried to answer it. So we do have, like, hopefully you guys got it, we do have contrastive explanations where it was all about reconciling models that would refute this point. But here it's not about the model difference, but just maybe they are not able to like compute plans with these kind of constraints, and they're just because of inferential capability they are not trying to make sense of it. So what this work does is they take that question, turn it into constraints on the original model, come up with a single example for it, right? And then you will compare your current plan with that single example and say, okay, this is why. As you can see, this plan has these properties which might not be desirable. A really good case would be enforcing that property causes it to be extremely costly. Then you can just say, okay, this plan is extremely costly, and that's why I didn't choose that property. Or like, that's why this plan is better. But unfortunately, such existential explanations might not always be enough. Because when you're like basically instantiating such a constraint, it might also bring up a lot of irrelevant details that you could show up, right? So if the question was, if the robot was asked, why did you survey room A and not room B? So now, according to the other approach, you'll come up with a full plan where you're going to room B. And one of those steps in the plan is, you are going to open, like the robot is going to open the door with its left trigger. Okay, before it was opening with right trigger. Now, if you're just showing the differences between this plan, this irrelevant detail might show up, and the human might not be able to kind of make sense of what's important, what's not. So another possibility is, you can think about universal explanation. So this actually is part of a paper that's going to be presented in AAAI 2020 from Rebecca Eifler and so I don't exactly know the thing, but so you guys can always follow up. So the universal explanation here is, you are going to explain in terms of properties that all the plans, right? If you're asking for a contrastive thing, let's say you're asking for a Q, why not Q? So you're going to provide explanation in terms of properties that every possible plan that can satisfy that constraint is going to have. So you're going to explain in those terms. And the way this paper kind of tries to operationalize this thing is by introducing this idea called plan properties, which are just like arbitrary Boolean properties that a plan either satisfies or not. And this is given upfront by the user. The user knows, so this is going to be the vocabulary of explanation. So this is, everybody has decided that these properties are important. The system knows it, the user knows it. The questions are going to be phrased in terms of this. Like, the questions are going to say, I don't want property P1, I need property P2. Right? The explanation are going to be in terms of these additional properties that are going to be entailed by this contrastive case. As in, like, if I choose to do P2, I also have to choose a plan which has P3, P4, and P5. And that's the kind of explanation, that the dependencies between these properties turn into the explanation you need. Right? I won't go to the details, but just to give a sense, one place where this naturally works out is oversubscription plan. Because you have a set of goals, and not all of the goals are going to be satisfied. Now the properties becomes whether a goal is satisfied or a goal is getting excluded. And then you can kind of talk in terms of these things. Right? So the example here, going back to our surveying thing, why did the robot not survey room A? So hopefully an explanation could be, surveying room A means not surveying room B or C. Right? So these kind of relations they can learn and just kind of provide as an explanation. Okay. Before we go any further, is there any questions? Okay. So, the next question we will kind of look at is, how do you explain optimality of an action, right? So, of course, the hope is once you reconcile all the models, they should be able to figure out that there exists no better solution. Right? But that may not always work out. The people might just get puzzled. They want to get like an intuition of why this action was chosen. So this is not like a complete answer to that question, but this is like a specific instantiation of that question within the context of MDPs, where the question is, in this state, why was action A chosen, not some other action? Right? And they use a very like a shallow kind of reasoning in the sense that they will just say that doing this action A in this state has better utilities than doing any other action and then following the policy. Of course, they don't just say this and just dust their hands and say, "Oh, good job done." But rather, you need to give an intuition as to why this value of doing this action is better. Right? And the way they do it is kind of give you a sense of where this action will lead to. Specifically, what high reward states will this action lead to eventually? And the way they kind of operationalize this is in terms of occupation frequency. Are people kind of familiar with occupation frequency? Let's not, well, I won't get into the details unless you guys are interested, but the idea is basically, there is a way of representing values in MDPs in terms of, from this current state, what is the expectation that you will end up in a different state, and then the rewards of the thing. And basically the explanation they have is in terms of these kind of occupation frequency. Basically they are saying that they can have a potential explanation for every future state, and they'll say, okay, this future state you will end up with this frequency. And really for the end user, this information could be presented in some form like open door A is likely to take you to corridor D, which let's assume is the state, X times. And you can always supplement this information with things like this frequency is this frequency X is more likely than any other action or something. So the intuition is when you have such explanation, you give enough of these about future state so that no matter how bad the other possible states are, like the rewards of the state are, it's still going to override the Q values of any other actions. Right? So you are going to say that, okay, this action A is going to lead you to this room with pressure, like some X frequency. You know that no matter how worse other things are, and the Q value, the correct Q values of other actions, this is still the value is high enough that you can take it as an explanation. And that's the kind of the reasoning they follow through. And they did actually test it in domains like, I think it was academic advising or something. I don't have slides for the results, but that's the kind of science. Okay. Now the last question I'll just kind of cover is this question of why is the task not solvable, right? We've talked about why is this action used, why this property, not some other property, why we talked about why is this the right action to do in this state. Now the question is, you have a problem, and the robot says, no, can't do it. It's not possible. Now the question is, why is this not solvable, right? So the two solutions I'm aware of in the literature for this kind of things is, one, either you can try to talk about a sub-goal that's required for this. Right? You can say that, okay, let's assume this scenario, the goal is get to this medkit, right? And getting to that medkit requires this sub-goal of getting into this room, right? You can say that kind of present to the human the sub-goal that you can't reach before getting to it. So you can say, okay, I can't get to the goal because I need to get to room 1 first, and that's not possible. The specific work we talked that did this, we actually also use things like abstraction and do things to simplify things. But this is like one information that's more inferential oriented. You're just kind of giving like you can think about it like a temporal abstraction. You're saying that okay, getting to the goal means achieving this sub-goal, and I can't get it. The other kind of possible information you can provide here, which was done by an older work, is you can think about excuses. The excuses are basically facts about, that paper specifically talked about initial state, like facts about initial state, if only that were not true, I could have solved the problem. Right? In this case, the fact could be that door A is locked. If only door A was not locked, I could have gotten to my key. So that those are like two of the techniques we've kind of seen in the literature that have kind of tried to answer the question of providing inferential explanations for these kind of questions. Okay, that brings us to the end of the first part about querying for decision rationale. Again, I'll still ask you guys any questions, but hopefully. Do you guys feel there were some questions, explanatory like query that is missing from this list that you guys thought might be interesting to discuss? Or something? Maybe we can bring it up at the end. Maybe that's something interesting to talk about. Okay, I'll probably go through this. Go through this a little faster. So that here, hopefully you guys remember. The motivation here is the fact that when you have large plans, large policy, just the act of presenting it becomes a pain. And you can't just expect to dump the entire policy of the entire plan and allow a person to make sense of it. So here we need to now use things like visualization or summarization to kind of help you across that process. So I'll just do maybe like go through like just a few words in each of these categories. The first one is like for visualization, this is like a rich literature on plan visualization. I'll just go over one, but that doesn't mean the rest are not interesting or anything, but it's because of lack of time. And also UISPs, I think it's happening along with XAP this time. They usually have a lot of work on visualizing the plans and stuff like that. The specific work we will look at today is this one called conductor, which basically uses this concept of metro maps. Hopefully, I don't have a picture of metro map, but hopefully it brings up some images like, you have stops and you have paths. They use that as the motivation, or like, let's not call it motivation, but rather inspiration for their visualization scheme. And basically, let's look at an example, right? So this is an example I took from the paper. Is it clear? Maybe I'll maybe walk you guys through it. So here you have like different actions in the plan as these different stops. And you have these fact routes, which are like the paths to it. And what is happening here is, you have a fact route per fluent, per state fact, right? And the fact route starts at the action where the fact is made true and goes all the way. So these are all the ones with the small bump are the actions where this fact is used as a precondition. So you can just follow it saying, okay, this fact was created here, and a fact route ends at the step where it's deleted. So you can think of that as the terminal stop. So this is the kind of the visualization technique they use. They also use it as like a way to allow people to kind of inform what the model should be. So because they can correct things here, saying, okay, this can't be a precondition and stuff like that. But this is just the general gist of the visualization procedure. So the other position you can take is, okay, even if I visualize plans, like there's going to be like hundreds or thousands of steps, hopefully, and then you can still make sense of it. I can just visualize the whole thing, and it still might be hard to make sense of it. So why not we just present the information that is required, right? For a person who's a layman, they don't really care about all the facts and stuff like that. They just want to kind of get a sense of what the plant is doing. And this paper basically kind of takes a very task-dependent view of it and kind of defines this verbalization space for the task of a robot route plan. Right? So basically, they look at like, these robot route plans could be extremely detailed because it contains things like the joint angles, stuff like that, exact positions they were involved and stuff like that. So they define this parameter space over these 3 terms. One is the abstraction, the level at which the vocabulary, they are going to talk about. Are they going to talk about in terms of like landmarks in the map? Are they going to talk about joint angles? Are they going to talk about time and stuff like that? So you can set these 4 levels. Then there's the specificity, that is how detailed are these explanations going to be. And locality, which is basically what part of the route are you going to focus on. Right? So I again won't go into details, but you can just kind of get a sense of what a verbalization, example verbalization would look like here. Like let's say I need a level 4 of abstraction, which is like the highest level of abstraction. I just want a general picture, and I want to get a global overview for this supposedly robot plan. And a verbalization at this instantiation of the parameters would look something like the robot starts in front of room 557 and finishes at 408. So that's the only information. And you can get more and more details by changing these parameters. Right? But that was a very task-dependent view of summarization. The point is, we don't always want to verbalize things. We might still want to kind of summarize the gist of a plan, right? And maybe decide the modality later and stuff like that. So here, again, there are a lot of work in summarization in plan literature. I just covered a few here, which kind of looks at these 3 possible ways of summarizing. One that relies on the fact that, okay, I'm going to just give you enough information that you can fill in the rest. Because you know what the model is. I'm just going to give you the details there. The second one is those present information as required, but allows you the ability to drill down further if required. And then the other one is like summarizing like sets of plans, where they are kind of trying to come up with, you can say descriptions that differentiate between like sets of plans. Okay, the first one is kind of interesting because it gets back to our like one of the core issues of like inferential stuff, which is like computation models. So here, this is a summarization case where the human knows the task. They know all the details. The robot has come up with a, let's say, complicated planning policy. If I was able to simulate the human's model, and I as the robot can simulate the human's learning model, I would know that if I give you some information about these 2 states, you can complete the rest, because I can kind of simulate what you are kind of going to do. And this is the approach this paper takes. And what they did was they hypothesized about 2 possible ways that the human might be computing such policies. And they kind of took it from like psychology literature. One is this IRL kind of, like inspired by, or I should say very similar to IRL kind of thing, where the human is looking at some parts of the trajectory, trying to infer what the goal is, and then try to complete the rest. The other one is what they more call as imitation learning kind of things, where they look at some states, where the human will think, okay, this is a state similar to one I saw. I'm sure the robot must do similar actions. So for either computation model, they turn it into a machine teaching problem. Again, not going into details unless you guys want me to. And the point, one of the interesting points is they did do some like user studies on these kind of computation models, and the results, as far as I could infer, isn't that clear, because in some more domains it seems the imitation learning did better, like summaries that were generated through imitation learning kind of summarization techniques did better than, or no, sorry. So what they did was they showed some summaries and they asked the people to complete it, and they asked how did they come up with it. And so from the description they were trying to make sense of what kind of computation model they used. And for some of the domains, the description seemed very similar to how the imitation learning methods work, in the sense that they were saying, okay, people were saying things like, okay, this looks like a state very similar to this, and that's why the robot did whatever. And in other cases, it tended towards more IRL-ish approach they were using. And their prediction on how well the summary would go did not really match the expectations. So there's a lot more work done, and what's the right way to kind of like model like human computational processes and limitations. The next three ones, summarization technique, I'll just go over quickly because they all kind of like follow the same kind of ideas in the sense that you're going to just provide enough information so that you can get more information if required. So one of the simplest way to do it is abstraction. So when you have abstraction, either you can do a state abstraction where you're going to present a simpler policy and people can like decide to drill down if required. And the way they make these abstractions is they define like an importance value to each of these factors, and you can just like project away factors that have low importance value. Similarly, you can think about temporal abstractions. There it's basically, again, you're just trying to come up with subcodes and stuff like that. And you can say that, okay, instead of doing this entire policy, you can say that the policy involves first getting to subgoal 1, then subgoal 2, then subgoal 3. And basically, one of the ways you can do it is kind of like compiling it down into classical planning problems. And these subgoals can be identified by extracting landmarks. And finally, the thing is, you can also directly provide a way to allow the user to query the policies. So you can ask questions like, when do you perform action A? And that's, you would need to give a characterization of like states where, like it'll be like a logical formula saying that, okay, when fact 1 and fact 2 is true, that's when I do an action A or something like that. And you can say that why action A instead of action B. So the thing to note here is, we've talked about why questions before answer, where we were giving decision rationale. This why question is just about the policy. When you say why action A instead of action B, we're just saying in this policy, action B is usually done when fact F is present. It doesn't mean anything, like that might have an arbitrary choice of the policy, not something that's part of the model. And the interesting part is, one of the interesting part is this also leverages like a method to kind of map like arbitrarily complex things into interpretable space before trying to provide answers. And then there's also works that have tried to differentiate sets of plans. So this is a work that appeared in last Skype. So where they try to learn, so given two sets of plans, set 1 and set 2, they try to come up with LTL formulas that the set 1 satisfies but not set 2. And so that's the kind of description they have, where they're saying, okay, the thing that is differentiating between these sets is the fact that this formula is satisfied here. And they also allow for like they kind of play around with the semantics of LTL in the sense that they kind of allow for like a noisy version where not all of the plans have to satisfy the LTL exactly. And they also propose, like, they basically restrict their focus to just some common LTL templates, and they also have like a sampling based approach where they try to, which is supposedly speeding up their search to find the exact LTL. And that, I think, brings me to the end of my section. There is some work on explaining observation, which I will probably not go through, because it's slightly different from the kind of explanation we've seen. But might be something interesting you guys can take use after. Okay, that brings an end to my section. Thank you.
So now we'll look at a completely different aspect of behavior. So far we've only looked at cooperative settings. But now we'll look at why we need to manipulate mental models, why an agent might need to manipulate, and what are some of the ways that we can do it in. So here I'll be talking about two types of behavior and a type of explanation in the form of lies. So essentially, a robot may have to preserve the user's privacy there might be multiple entities that are looking at the user's data, and it might be necessary for the robot to stop some sensitive information from falling into hands of adversarial entities. And that's one of the reasons why the robot might want to manipulate an adversarial observer's mental model. Another thing is the robot might want to save the user from unnecessary amount of computational load, and so might give a simpler explanation. So these are two reasons why the robot might want to manipulate an adversarial observer's mental model. So one is, so let's look at obfuscation. So this behavior allows the robot to basically confuse the adversarial observer. So the idea is that the true sensitive information is hidden, and there are multiple possibilities that are consistent with the observation sequence now, which can confuse the adversarial entity. On the other hand, deception is something like lying, but with behavior. So here the idea is that the robot might mislead the adversary into believing some decoy goal as the true goal. And then you have lies. And Takagata will speak more about this later. So, obfuscating behavior. So generally in this setting, what we have is, there's like some sensitive information which can be actually, say, a true goal of the robot, and the robot wants to obfuscate this or hide this true goal from the adversary by showing them multiple possible goals. So the adversary has access to all of these candidate goals, but does not know what the true goal of the actor is. And again, the adversary updates their belief as and when they see the observations. They update their belief on the set of candidate goals. So here we have an agent that is trying to pick up one of the two medkits. And by taking a middle path, it's kind of confusing the observer from understanding which of the two medkits it's actually going for. So the idea is basically to synthesize a behavior that increases the adversary's uncertainty over the set of goals that are possible. So let's look at one type of goal obfuscation. So this is again an offline setting, and here again the observer has like partial observability. So the same thing that I had mentioned before. The robot is moving, but the human doesn't know, or the adversarial observer doesn't know which direction the robot is heading in. Now let's look at how goal obfuscation can be performed, how the robot can confuse the adversary in such a setup. So here, again, the robot has to do a task of surveying a room and treating a victim, but it doesn't want to reveal which victim the robot is treating. So what it can do is, it can first do the survey action. So now, both the victims are at equidistant places, and therefore the robot is not really revealing which victim it treated. So here the idea is completely opposite of what we saw with goal legibility. This is like the flip side of it, and the idea is here to have at least k candidate goals inclusive of the true goal in the adversary's final belief. And so this results in plans that are called k-ambiguous plans, because there are at least now k candidate goals that the observer may think are like true goal of the robot. But not all goal obfuscation can be secure. So what I mean by that is the goal obfuscation should follow some of these cryptographic assumptions. For example, the adversary may have access to the actor's algorithm. So that means that they know how the algorithm actually works. And there may also be independence of inputs. That means that they can run the algorithm again and again on different inputs. Still, your algorithm shouldn't reveal any extra information to the adversary. And other couple two assumptions are delivery of observations is fair and in order. That means the adversary cannot really change the observation function or the sequence of the order or the sequence of the observations. That the adversary is a semi-honest adversary. That is, they cannot really modify the environment in which the actor is operating. So let's look at this setup. Here now we have 3 different medkits that the robot can pick. One of them is the true goal, that is the one pointed there. Say a k-ambiguous plan involves taking 3 steps to each of these 2 goals. And so now you have k equal to 2, so at least 2 goals are satisfied in this plan. But now, is this plan secure? No, not really. Because let's set another goal. Among the k goals, this was the other goal. Let's now set this as the true goal and now run the algorithm again. It may generate a different solution altogether. And then, if the adversary has access to your algorithm, they can run it on the set of goals and know which goal you ran it for. And that will tell them which is the actual goal that you were actually trying to obfuscate. So, the main point here is that regardless of the adversary having access to the algorithm, there should not be any extra information revealed to them. And one way to do is by randomizing the true goal. So what you do is you select the k set of goals inclusive of the true goal initially, and you randomly pick one of them as the true goal. It may or may not be your true goal. And then you find a k-ambiguous plan with respect to that decoy true goal. And then if the adversary runs again, they still know that this goal was the goal that was used to run the algorithm. But that goal might not necessarily be your true goal. So since it's randomized, there is no more information revealed to them than what they already knew. And this is one way that you can basically make the goal obfuscation secure. There's another approach to achieving secure goal obfuscation, and that is minimizing the bias towards any of the goals. The observation sequence should not reveal anything about any specific goal. And there are 3 particular properties that the observation sequence has to satisfy in order to achieve this. And first one is each goal there should exist a plan that achieves all the goals in T steps. This is pretty obvious. Then the observation associated with all the k plans should be the same, yes. And the observation should not be biased by any goal. That is, no single goal should have more posterior probability than any other goal. They should all be equal. This constraint makes the goal obfuscation process difficult, but it ensures complete secure obfuscation. And in cases where the full plan is not possible, the user can actually produce a partial but secure obfuscated plan and then make like an optimal plan with the rest of the steps. So now let's look at plan obfuscation. Here the main idea is that the goal is known, but you want to obfuscate the actions. That is how the goal was achieved. Again, we will assume the same setup here, an offline setting and partial observability. Now let's look at this example. We visited this example before in predictability, where we were trying to make sure that the path is predictable. Now we want to make sure that the path is not at all predictable, that the actions cannot be predicted. And therefore, if the robot basically chooses this leftmost medkit, then there are multiple plans that can be used to achieve that medkit, and they all give the same observation sequence. Because we assume that the move action did not reveal which direction the robot went in. And so depending on the sensor model, what kind of actions are possible, based on that, you can basically come up with these solutions. And so the idea here is that you can have at least L plans that have high amount of diversity. That is at least the distance away from each other. And this is called L diverse plan. And again, we can use plan distance metrics like action set distance, causal link distance, etc. to compute the diversity between the plans. And note that all these plans are achieving the exact same goal and they all have the same observation sequence. So you have to find multiple plans that have high diversity that achieve that same goal. Now let's look at another approach. We can also use environment design for achieving privacy. So again here the idea is to obfuscate the true goal. But the idea is to have a true goal obfuscated for as long as possible. So for that what you do is you find a closest goal to this true goal and construct a prefix, a plan prefix that is maximally common. So basically non-distinctive. So you find a goal that is that has the highest non-distinctive prefix with your true goal, and then you can use so basically here you have two goals. The rightmost is your true goal, and the middle one is the decoy goal that you're using. And as long as you're going until here, it is not very clear which of the two goals you're going for. And basically, the design so basically by knowing what is the worst case distinctiveness between these plans, you can model your sensor models accordingly to see if a certain path, if a certain WCD by sensor model is say not very different, then you may not choose to construct that kind of a complicated sensor model. So it basically allows you to balance the amount of like obfuscation you can achieve and the amount of design cost that is required to say construct the sensor model of that type. So now let's look at deception. As I told before, this is mostly about like lying, but with behavior. So deception, this work talks about two strategies, two main strategies. So the first strategy is simulation. So here you're basically showing the false. That is, you're making the adversary think that the decoy goal is the true goal. That is done as follows. Here you have a robot that is trying to access to one of the two medkits. Its true goal is to access the leftmost medkit, but one way to deceive the adversary is by taking an optimal path to the decoy goal and then taking an optimal path from there. So for the most of the plan, your goal is your true goal is obfuscated. There's another deceptive strategy. This is about dissimulation. Here you are trying to hide what is real. That is, you are trying to hide your real goal and confuse the observer, similar to goal obfuscation that we saw before. The idea here is to choose the closest decoy goal possible, closest decoy goal available to your true goal, and then take a path to the midpoint between those. So that midpoint basically is a point where both the goals now have equal probability given your observation sequence. So take an optimal path to that goal, and from there compute a optimal path to your true goal. So basically, until you reach the midpoint, it is not clear where you're going, and then you just take the direct optimal route to your true goal. So this strategy 3, it kind of improves on the previous strategy that I just mentioned. So here, you still take the optimal path to the midpoint, but now you're trying to favor the decoy goal. So instead of choosing actions like this, which could have been like favoring this goal, now you're going like this, right side, to show that you're trying to favor the other goal. And then you can improve on the previous strategy also. What you can do is you can prune out all the truthful nodes in your search. By that, what I mean is nodes for which the posterior probability of your true goal is higher than that of the decoy goal. So given the observation sequence, if the true goal is more likely, then you don't take such nodes. You prune out all those nodes, and then what you are left with are the nodes where the either the probability of the decoy goal is higher or is equal to that of the true goal. And that way, you don't have any actions in your plan that are now favoring the true goal explicitly. This is about deception. Do you guys have any questions? Tathagata will now come and talk about lies.
Alright, so in terms of different kinds of deceptive capabilities, so far Ananda has been talking about how to use behavior to deceive the human in the loop. Here we will talk about explanations, so a form of communication where you are coming up with facts about the robot's model that are not true to convince the human that what the robot did was the best course of action. And to explain how to lie with explanations, we'll go back to this model reconciliation formulation that we were talking about in the first half of the tutorial. Specifically, we talked about this idea of minimal model explanations, which are the minimal number of model updates you need to provide to the human to convince them that there are no better course of action. So we call them minimal explanations, and we looked at the types of those explanations in terms of minimal completeness, which preserves the optimality in the updated model, and monotonicity, where further updates do not invalidate a previous explanation. So that's the model reconciliation setting. As an example, let's go back to the search and reconnaissance example. Here's a map of the environment that the human has access to. And they have given the robot the goal to reach the swimming pool area. And the plan that the robot has come up with is shown in blue. And of course, given the human's understanding of the environment, there are far better plans available, right? So you can go through the door at the top. And so in that case, this is a way worse plan than what you would expect. However, it turns out that in the actual model that the robot has, parts of the environment is blocked. So that plan is no longer available to the robot. So it turns out that in the robot's model, this is actually the best plan possible. Now, if you compute the minimal explanations to this, you would have to provide two model updates. The fact that those two were blocked. So of the five differences in the model, so there were 4 blockages and 1 new path that has opened up. You require to provide 2 model updates to convince the human that this is the best possible plan. So this is the correct explanation. We also talked about explicability, where you take a more costlier road. So you can clear those rubble and go through the original expected path, in which case the fact that you cleared the rubble is a costlier action, but you are closer to what the human expected. So these are the kind of behaviors we got from reconciling models. The key part of this is that while computing this, we always stayed consistent with the ground truth model that the robot believes is true. So that is to say that there is a spectrum of model differences, and all the updates that we are giving are along that spectrum. So it's true in the robot's own model, and so all the updated facts are what the robot believes to be true. And if we relax that and still preserve all the other properties of an explanation, we can get to what we call lies. Right? So we can come up with information that's not true in the robot's ground truth, but still preserve all the other constraints. So you can make sure that the human cannot come up with a better plan given that information, even though that information is not true. And specifically, we looked at two different kinds of these false explanations. One that we call lie affirmation, where you start removing parts of the original model to justify why the given plan was done. And theoretically, what happens is that if it turns out that the human mental model is somewhere between the minimally complete explanation and the minimally monotonic explanation of an empty model, then you can start removing parts from the mental model to get to this sort of a lie. And what this would look like is that the robot is denying capabilities that it already has in order to justify a plan that the human initially thought was not the best possible thing to do, but now they would believe that it is. In the other case, we would go out of the current space of models and generate facts that are likely to be true, or at least make some sense given the model that we are working in, but they are not actually in the robot's model. So some of these forms of extending models show up in applications like story generation, where you need some sort of creativity to extend your current model into newer models that will generate newer stories. So there's some work on that from Julie Portier's on using planning techniques to generate stories. There's also work on modeling drift of models. So you're trying to predict how a given model can evolve over time. And you can use these techniques to depart from the ground truth and generate explanations that are not consistent with the ground truth right now, but will actually explain the plan that's given to the human. The reason that we want to do this, maybe because it's computationally easier to do this than actually generate the correct explanation, or the explanations that you get out from this may be shorter than the true explanation, in which case it might be easier to explain to the human using a false explanation than actually taking them through the correct reason for your decisions. So we can see this in the previous example. So here, this was the ground truth model of the robot, and this is the plan that they were trying to justify. There is a possibility to provide just one update instead of the two for a minimally complete explanation. So one false update can actually explain this plan. So this false update is not true, but it's shorter than the real explanation. And at times it may be easier to compute. And so both from the computational point of view as well as the interaction point of view, there might be places where this makes sense to the robot to come up with this sort of an explanation. So this is a lie affirmation where they added this fact that spot is blocked, even though it is not. And then if you are using model extension techniques, such as the ones used in storytelling, to convince a planning person that that area is blocked, you can say something like there's a 1% area, and people will believe it. So that's also a case where you're extending domains. So in general, to persuade the human, it's a much more general task than just explaining. All you need to make sure is that the foils that they're coming up with have been negated, and so they cannot come up with better solutions. So you can really drop the robot's ground truth model from the formulation of the persuasion problem. So in all the formulations of explanations, The three inputs that went in was the original plan that the robot has come up with, their own model, and its expectation of the human mental model. You can drop the robot's own model and still persuade the human of the validity or justify why the decision was made without any consideration of what the actual ground truth is. So we have a series of work looking at this from the point of view of how to generate them, as well as how these are perceived from the end user perspective. So I won't go into the details of the user studies, but we basically tried out different kinds of lies, asked people how humans perceive them. In general, people were in favor of using them if they are computationally viable, but only if they are lying to the robot and not the other way around, which is something we should respect. An interesting case where this shows up is in doctor-patient relationships, where sometimes lies are accepted. So you could think of if the doctor thinks that the patient should know about something, or if they will get better if the patient knew something that's not true. Then in certain circumstances, people have used lies in the practice of medicine. And in these papers, we go into details of how we can learn lessons from that while designing AI agents. And one of the interesting things that come out of the study of doctor-patient relationship is the idea of how to deal with situations when what you lied about has actually not worked out, and so who the liability belongs to. And for human AI interactions, it will always be the case that you have to fall back and get consent before you can actually do something like this. So, but then again, that could also influence how the humans will perceive your own behavior. So it's a very interesting topic, and if you want to go into more details, you can check those papers out. I think we will conclude the deception part here. I will move on to some fun applications that we looked at for human-aware planning and explanations in general. But if there are any questions before that, let's take it now. How much time do we have?
What, maximum 20 minutes?
20 minutes? Okay. So the next 20 minutes, I will go into some of the applications that we have looked at for many of the algorithms we talked about till now. The first one is about collaborative decision making. So it's well understood that humans and AI have different complementary capabilities. So AI agents can do, say, constant satisfaction better. Humans have much more intuition about stuff. So in general, using their complementary capabilities in collaborative decision making usually leads to better results. And the current use case that I will talk about is this case of decision making environment in a smart room that we used to use in the IBM office in Yorktown till a couple of years ago. The way the interactions look like is something like this.
Something like this. You'll get chubby competitors though. Smith Microsoftware.
I found 87 companies.
A place where humans and computers work together to make million and billion dollar decisions. At the center of this partnership is Celia.
So as you could tell, there's always a directive from the user saying Celia do X, Celia do Y, and it will do it, but it was a very procedural form of interaction. So even though Celia itself had many sensors and algorithms running in the backend, it was always invoked by the human. But unfortunately, that's not how human-humans interaction happens, right? So we don't always specifically address the person we are working with, and then everything doesn't stop with a single step response. So you want the agent to take more action and more deliberative action over longer terms. So a couple of years ago, we started putting AI algorithms, AI planning algorithms in the back in order to recognize what the user intent is and plan with those intents over longer terms. And we had some success over that in being able to turn the agent into a more proactive agent, so it can have some sense of autonomy, inject its own actions into the workflow, and then respond over a longer period of time. However, it turned out that the kind of behaviors that we got were at times surprising to the users in the loop. And providing proactive support is not always the best way to go about things, especially when the autonomy of the agent increases, we lose common grounds. And that's where the model difference aspects come into play. So this was something that happened while we were demoing in the room to a client, and we expected that the agent would come in and do its stuff, and everybody would be happy. But it turned out that the moment the agent came in with its own suggestions, we didn't know why it suggested that. We don't know how it came to that decision. And instead of everybody being happy, we were all looking at each other saying, why did it come up with this decision? Even though that's what we wanted to model in the first place. And the reason this happens, especially for an environment like smart rooms, is, so these are called embodied agents, and they don't have, so they're not like robots. So you know the robot is here, it's looking around in its own vicinity. Embodied agents are embodied through actuators, sensors, microphones, cameras in the room. So they are software behind a bunch of sensors. And so there's a huge amount of model difference here. The humans in the loop do not know what the agent knows, what the agent has seen, and what is the thought process from going from those sensors to the higher level decisions. So, so we started investigating this problem and went to tackle the problem at different levels. So we wanted to do explanations, of course, but we also wanted to tackle the visualization of the thought process of the agent in the backend. And the first thing that we did was to come up with a way to externalize what was going on inside the agent's head. And a part of the externalization process was to come up with a visualization scheme for all the levels of decision making that the agent was doing. So coming from the very low level inputs, what does it see, what does it hear, to a slightly higher level objects derived from those sensors, like what are the objects that it's seen from the stream, what are the objects that it has understood from the speech, and then to even higher order reasoning, like plan recognition planning, where you try to identify what kind of task is going on in the room from the objects that have been recognized. So as you go up this hierarchy, you get higher and higher order capabilities. And this is something that we could always ask the agent. So when we don't know what it's doing, we could bring this up. So you could say like, what's going on inside your head? And there was a part of the room which will always show us what's going on in the back end. So, and this would be real time. So, in this case, there are two people talking about a particular project which is codenamed Water, and because a lot of the people in the room would be they're coming in and out, are not part of the project itself. It was very robust to identifying unknown people. So people it knew were there and doing some things, but didn't know who it was. And then it will give you a reading of what exactly is going on in the room in real time. I won't go into the details of like what each of these individual tasks was, but the underlying framework towards coming up with this distribution was a form of plan recognition algorithm. And the explanations that it was giving in terms of why it understood those facts was in what plans would be completed if those facts were true. And so we also needed a way to actually visualize those longer plans and visualize what caused the agent to think about these plans being the right ones. And so we cast this visualization process as an explanation process, where we are saying that you can use the same model reconstitution process that we talked about through the tutorial, but instantiate it with an empty model. And that gives you a summary of what's going on in the agent's head, insofar as the planning process goes. So it's a minimal It's a minimal version of the planning problem that could have given rise to the same plan. And that allows you to prune out the unnecessary information. And if you're looking for explanations, it will give you what salient parts of the model actually contributed to a particular plan. So for example, if you have a particular planning problem where there are many solutions, and it's a large model, so there are many parts of the model that contribute to that plan. You can use the model reconciliation technique with an empty model to come to a situation where most of the irrelevant facts are being pruned out, and the ones that we actually visualize are the ones that actually contributed to that plan. So, so the takeaways from this sort of a visualization is that, one, we want to visualize from the sensory data to the higher level reasoning processes what is being observed, what the agent extracts from those observations, and how they contribute to the higher level reasoning processes. And then once we go to all the through these steps, we also want to visualize and explain why those decisions were being made in terms of their decision making, impact on the decision making of the agent. And we do that by using model reconciliation as a summarization technique, using an empty model. So that's the case of embodied agents. But in general, collaborative decision making happens across many applications. So you can think of command and control, decision support in general, like in disaster response, queue scheduling, and of course in intelligent triggering systems. In every one of these situations, the roles of the humans and the AI kind of vary a bit. So you could think of in command and control, the decision support is in support of whatever plans the commanders are making. In tutoring systems, it's slightly different because the right model is with the tutoring system and not with the student. But then you can't just give them the right solution, you have to guide them through their learning stages. So even though you know the model, you can just provide that to the human. And we did a bunch of work in all of these domains, including like disaster response, queue scheduling, and tutoring systems, where many of these themes repeat. So there are humans making plans, and humans are not good at making plans. So how you can complement what information they have, what constraints they are considering with support from automated planning, trying to make them better plans faster. So for example, you could be collaboratively fixing a given plan. You could be suggesting new plans. You could be validating what the humans came up with. And while you are doing these, while you are suggesting new plans to the human, they might be asking for why questions on your recommendations. And that's where the model reconciliation part comes back in, because you have to explain your recommendations to the human. And again, there are model differences. The system and the human have different capabilities, different information available to them, and you have to again reconcile those things. This is also another case where both of the models of the user and the system changes over time, because the human is not always right and neither is the system. So sometimes the system is reconciling the human's model, sometimes it's the other way around where the human gets to come back and say, that's not actually the right thing, this has changed, and so on. So it's an iterative process, and it's a bidirectional process as well. And again, explanations and visualizations are very much related. And as you add more complexity to the environment, so for example, decision support, if there are many humans involved in the loop, visualization again becomes a problem. So usually, there's a well-established control room kind of setting where these decisions get made, but these are like a centralized environment where everybody is looking at a big screen trying to make decisions, and there's a lot of information being overloaded on that screen. And as the system is providing explanations, some of them are not necessary for the other people, and so it creates a lot of clutter. So one of the things that we also looked at is using mixed reality systems to overlay more information on top of the shared screen. And that overlay is personalized to individual users. So if there are many decision makers in the loop, you can have the same version of the screen overlaid with private information, overlaid with explanations that are tailored to your own questions, etc. And while the rest of the group has a shared understanding of the overall task. And finally, in most of these applications, you will notice that the human in the loop is an expert in the domain. And usually anytime you build applications for end users, you have to test them out and to see if they actually work. But for decision support, it's a hard task, because if you have to go to the point where you are evaluating with the experts in the loop, but your algorithm has to be of high enough fidelity to get there first. And so one of the ways to improve your algorithms is to design domains where the participants you have can be domain experts. So for example, in a university setting, you can look for decision support tasks where the students can be domain experts themselves. And that gives you much more stronger signal into what kind of decision support works, what doesn't. So one of the things that we did was we tasked the task of making a course of study for students as a planning task. And we asked students to create their own courses of study in a university. And that allowed us to have access to participants who have to do this, who know the domain, and can give us data in the form of domain experts. And so the usual trends that we saw, that both features like validation of plans and suggesting of new plans were very useful, and they were more useful together. And so people did find it useful that some of the things that we couldn't find significant use was in providing some forms of explanation that were giving more information to the users so they can improve over time. We didn't see that, but in general, this sort of setup allows you to have much more direct access to feedback where you can tune your decision support algorithms and make them better over time. So that's a summary of decision support use cases. The other example that I will look at is slightly different. So this is about designing of dialogue agents or model acquisition in general. So the previous one in decision support, it was humans making plans. These are humans making models. Here the task is to specify a dialogue agent, and what we want to get to is a system that can identify mistakes in those models and surface them to the user when they are unsure why the agent is not working as intended. So a bit of background, the way conversation agents are designed these days, there is a designer of a dialogue flow who sits in and designs the entire flow by hand. And you end up with these huge dialogue trees that are very hard to manage and edit. And as they evolve over time, you lose control over the dialogue. And so it's a very hard process, and it's completely manual. And so as planning people, we looked at this and said that you can clearly form a declarative specification of the dialogue. So the job of making the entire flow is not with the designer, but with the planner in the back. And then they can design something declaratively and hand it off to the planner. And you don't have to design the tree by hand. So that's what we worked on in finding a declarative model of dialogue design. And the way this works is you design the dialogue in terms of variables and actions. These are just capabilities and description of the agent. So you could think of a capability as asking something to the user or pinging an API endpoint. And so these are things that the system can do. And then the bot is designed in terms of a set of these capabilities, right? So you can, so the three capabilities that the bot would have is to ask people through speech actions, make logical inferences in the backend, or ping cloud functions to get some internal system action. So for example, if you want to open an account, there's a cloud function that calls an API endpoint to open an account. And once you have that, you can have the usual planning formalism where you get an action defined in terms of what it requires to get done and what happens when you do that action. And in particular, we were looking at non-deterministic forms of planning, where you plan for all execution time contingencies at listening time, but only one of them occur at runtime. So you determine the effect at runtime, but plan for all the effects of listening time. So that gives the planner in the backend a way to compose the entire dialog tree automatically. So that was the initial promise of this system. However, it turns out that humans are not good planners themselves, and neither are they good domain modelers. So even though the capability of the system was there to generate the dialog tree, the designer would often be stuck with situations where they don't know what the imperative consequences of their declarative specification is. They'll be asking like, why is there no solution? Why is this other thing not a solution? Or how this example not supported by the model. And so Sarath previously talked about a lot about using model abstraction as a way to provide explanations in simpler form. We actually adopted that work in designing these agents. And what we did was, from the very complex agent that's been specified, if it's not solvable, we find an abstract version of that. Ask the designer to fix the problems in the abstract version, and then propagate those changes into the more complex version until the model is fixed. So as an example, I won't of course go into the entire details of the system, but this is a snapshot of what the explanation looks like. What's going on here is there's a declarative specification in the back. So this is the 7 actions in the domain that the agent has access to, and so in this case the designer is not happy with the current dialog flow is coming up with. So they have identified what we call a storyboard of things that they want to happen. So the storyboard is basically the designer saying, I think this should be supported, but from what I have specified till now, it's not. And so it's asking the system, why is this conversation not supported by what I have specified? And so the explanation is composed of a set of things. First, it tells you a landmark that's not achievable. So in order for that dialog to work, it's telling you that this thing has to be achieved. But also it's giving you a minimal version of that model to fix first. And this is the kind of interactive workflow we repeat again and again in this explainable form, is that anytime something is not solvable, we ask them to solve the minimal version of the problem. So on the left-hand side, that's the one that's solvable in the minimal form. And then if this is solvable, the user can propagate that to the fuller model. So in this case, even if they propagated it the first time, the user still wasn't happy with what they got. So you can find, again, a foil that's not solvable, solve the minimal form, and then propagate again. And this is the final dialog tree that comes out. If you notice that there are 7 declarative actions here, and the final dialog tree is pretty big, and it's beyond what the designer can specify manually. So to reach complexities of dialog agents of this form, this is the only way to get there. But it's a very interesting task of making it more accessible to users. And some of the from the explainable AI techniques we talked about actually go a long way towards bringing the required expertise down. So, so as a review of the applications we looked at, most of the talk we just talked about human-robot teaming, where the agent is making plans and there are misaligned expectations. We also, from the application point of view, we looked at decision support where the humans are making plans, and again you have misaligned expectations. And then the last one is where the human is actually making models, And again, there are misaligned expectations because they make mistakes while writing those models. So that's a wrap of it, of the applications. I think Rao will do a conclusion if there are no questions.
So yeah, I guess can you get that last overview slide?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's not quite sure what the conclusion part should be. If there are specific questions on, so let me get that slide back, and then we can continue this. So we basically said, I mean, it looks like many years back, when we started this tutorial, we basically talked about, the introduction is breezy enough because, mental modeling is a useful thing to do, and you can use that to, do a variety of tasks. And actually, much of what has been done in the rest of the tutorial is talking about specific research efforts in our group as well as outside, which basically take this idea of mental modeling and reasoning with the mental models, learning the mental models, reasoning with them, to either do cooperative behavior, provide explanations, or to do adversarial behavior, or tell lies, which is the later part. And then, Tathagata actually also talked about a variety of applications that don't come right away to your mind when you mostly think in terms of humans and robots working on specific tasks, but some of them are really AI software systems that humans are working in the loop, and most of the ideas wind up being quite relevant there too, and so that's kind of a useful thing to keep in mind. The applications that are currently that we are aware of, would be worthwhile to get a sense of. So I think that before, we actually recorded the whole thing. So in fact, I think it's hard enough for me to get all the details, even though I know most of it. But I'm pretty sure unless the few superhuman people like Giuseppe may have done everything, but the rest of you probably didn't. And so we will put that recording up so that in case there are pieces that you wanted to get back to, then we'll be able to do that. So that's sort of the logistics part of it. And so are there questions that anybody has about that you would like to discuss? I should also mention that we're all going to be here. I'm here until Wednesday. You can pigeonhole any of us and ask questions outside of it too. I am trying to actually end a little before 6 because 6 is when the reception starts, and I don't want you to pay the price of coming to this tutorial and not get your drinks. But are there any questions that anybody has that we should discuss right now? Yes, go ahead.
One just small question, and I mean, in the application level, so for you and you, the systems explained and introduced to us is that just utilizing some consulting work for like IBM or decision-making system development to a certain their clients. What level of realization or utilization so far achieved?
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, so well, it depends on the application. So the two that we looked at are like completely different fields. In the first one, parts of it have been deployed. The second one is work in progress. But so we worked on the dialogue system since like last 10 months, and the initial version of the system we tried out with users, and that's where we faced some of the explainability issues. Because people who write dialogue right now, they have a very specific model of how things work, because they would be basically enumerating all the nodes in the tree, and that's what they do. So asking them to think differently requires a shift and a training process, which was a difficulty. So that's why we went into the path of actually the system being explained to the user and not being just retraining people to use a system that's not easy to use. So part of the newest work that we are doing on explaining those systems is actually trying to make sure that the same users who design dialogues right now can adopt to this newer way of doing it and get to more complicated agents. but they can still basically shift without the retraining process. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so I want to end with one more funny thing. So I bought this T-shirt. I don't know if you guys can read this. I thought, given the craziness of people not believing in science, that this basically says science doesn't care what you believe in. That's true, but your AI system should care about what you believe in, and it should actually have a sense of your mental models so that it can work with you more effectively. Science doesn't care about us, but our AI systems hopefully will. And I think there's a bunch of things that that come out because taking that part in seriously into consideration, including cooperation as well as deception, and it will be worthwhile keeping in mind. Thank you again for your patience and